Seth Hollister kicked through the charred debris scattered across what used to be the Silver Moon's main floor. The wooden planks beneath his boots creaked ominously, still bearing scorch marks from a fire that happened 3 years ago. At 37, Seth had weathered enough hardships to recognize when a fresh start came with strings attached. This saloon, this opportunity, felt like salvation after losing the ranch to 3 consecutive seasons of drought. Yet something in the air made the hair on his neck stand on end. His wife, Georgia, stood near the doorway, her practical dress already dusted with ash, studying the damage with calculating eyes. At 35, the former schoolteacher had developed a knack for seeing patterns others missed. Right now, her furrowed brow told Seth she was sensing the same disquiet he felt. "The foundation looks solid," Seth called out, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "We can rebuild this into something profitable." Georgia nodded, but her eyes continued their methodical assessment. The townspeople had been too eager to sell, too quick to look away when they mentioned the Silver Moon. Even the land agent had rushed through the paperwork, practically throwing the deed at them before hurrying off. After 15 years of marriage, she'd learned to trust her instincts. Something about this place made people uncomfortable, and it wasn't just the fire damage. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through gaps in the burned roof, casting long shadows across the floor. Seth moved deeper into the building, testing floorboards with his weight before committing to each step. Their life savings had gone into this property, a suspiciously affordable property. At less than half the price of comparable buildings in neighboring towns, the Silver Moon had seemed like Providence after years of financial struggle. Georgia pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, wiping soot from a window to peer outside. A few townspeople hurried past, their gazes deliberately averted from the saloon. Earlier at the general store, conversation had died when they'd mentioned their purchase. The shopkeeper had wrapped their supplies in tense silence, offering only clipped responses to George's attempts at friendly conversation. "There's history here they're not telling us," George's voice carried across the empty space. "Did you notice how the mayor wouldn't meet our eyes at the deed signing?" Seth nodded, crouching to examine a section of flooring that had suffered less damage than the surrounding area. His carpentry skills, learned from his father and honed during years of ranch maintenance, would be essential in restoring this place. If they could create a respectable establishment, perhaps it would help them integrate into a community that seemed determined to keep them at arm's length. "People get strange about failures," Seth reasoned, though doubt colored his words. "Nobody likes being reminded of town tragedies. Fire like this, property standing empty for years, it's an eyesore, a reminder of better days gone." Georgia stepped carefully toward him, notebook in hand. She'd already begun cataloging repairs needed, estimating costs with the precision that had once made her an excellent teacher of mathematics. "It's more than that. Did you hear what that old man at the hotel said when he thought we weren't listening? Those poor fools bought a grave, not a business." Seth frowned, prying at a loose floorboard near the back wall. It gave more easily than expected, revealing solid wood beneath that had somehow escaped the worst of the fire damage. "People talk, especially when newcomers arrive with big plans." It wasn't just talk, Seth. It was fear. The board came free in Seth's hands, and he set it aside to examine the space beneath. Expecting to find more fire damage, his fingers instead brushed against something cold and metallic, a handle perfectly preserved beneath the ash and debris. Curiosity piqued, he pulled harder, feeling resistance, then sudden give, as an entire section of the floor lifted like a trapdoor. "Georgia," he whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "Come look at this." She hurried over, careful to avoid weakened sections of flooring. Peering into the openings, she gasped. Below them stretched a basement that shouldn't exist. Clean, untouched by fire, with stone walls that looked far older than the saloon above. But what made their blood run cold were the dozens of personal belongings arranged with methodical precision along the walls. Boots still holding their shape, dresses carefully folded, pocket watches stopped at different times, all arranged as if their owners had simply disappeared. "This shouldn't be here," Seth murmured, lowering himself cautiously through the opening. The deed mentioned no basement. Georgia followed, her practical skirts gathering dust as she descended the crude ladder. The air below felt different, cooler but also stale, with an underlying scent she couldn't identify. The preservation of the space was unnerving. While the saloon above had been gutted by flames, this room remained pristine, as if the fire had never happened. Why would someone hide this? Georgia gripped Seth's arm. And why does none of this look damaged by the fire? Seth shook his head, moving slowly along the wall where personal effects had been arranged like exhibits in a macabre museum. A man's boots, well worn but carefully maintained. A woman's hairbrush, several long strands still caught in the bristles. A child's wooden toy, painted colors still bright in the lantern light. Each item positioned with deliberate care, each telling a fragment of a story neither of them could piece together. Georgia, ever methodical even in the face of the inexplicable, removed her notebook and began documenting what they found. Names from pocket watch inscriptions, monograms on handkerchiefs, dates from letters found folded between pages of books. The systematic approach helped calm her racing thoughts, imposing order on a discovery that threatened to overwhelm. Marcus, she murmured, carefully examining a pocket watch inscription. To Marcus, with love always, Elena. The name triggered a memory from earlier that day. She'd heard it whispered in the general store, followed by abrupt silence when the shopkeeper noticed her listening. Seth moved deeper into the basement, his lantern light revealing the true extent of the space. Far larger than the saloon's footprint above, the basement extended beneath what should have been adjacent buildings or even the street itself. Stone walls showed signs of expert craftsmanship, not a rushed addition, but something built with care and precision, designed to last. Against the far wall, Seth's light revealed a series of marks scratched into the stone. Moving closer, he realized they were tally marks. 5 vertical lines crossed by a horizontal slash, repeated in neat rows. He counted quickly, a chill settling in his stomach as the number became clear. 118 marks in total. Georgia, he called, voice tighter than before. Do you remember what the land agent said about people leaving town? She joined him, squinting at the marks. That over the past 15 years, folks had been moving on to better opportunities elsewhere. Understanding dawned in her eyes. He said around 120 people had left for bigger towns or Western territories. 118, Seth corrected, pointing to the tally marks. That's the exact count here. A coincidence too precise to be dismissed. Georgia's hand trembled slightly as she added this detail to her notes. The methodical arrangement of belongings, the hidden nature of the basement, the townspeople's avoidance of the property. Pieces of a puzzle neither of them had recognized they were solving until this moment. Above them, floorboards creaked, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing what should be an empty building. Someone knew they were here, knew exactly where to walk to avoid the creakiest boards. Seth extinguished their lantern with a quick twist, plunging them into darkness, broken only by thin streams of light filtering through cracks in the floor above. George's fingers found Seth's in the darkness, squeezing tightly as the footsteps stopped directly over the open trapdoor. Dust filtered down between the boards as the unknown visitor shifted their weight. Neither Seth nor Georgia dared breathe, pressed against the stone wall as seconds stretched painfully into minutes. The silence broke with the sound of the trapdoor slamming shut, followed by the scrape of something heavy being dragged across it. They were trapped. Light the lantern, Georgia whispered, practical even in crisis. We need to find another way out. Seth fumbled with matches in the absolute darkness, finally managing to relight their lantern. The warm glow revealed Georgia already examining the walls, searching for another exit. Her teacher's instincts had shifted seamlessly into survival mode. Analyze the problem, identify solutions, maintain calm. There must be another entrance, Seth reasoned, joining the search. No one would build a space this large with only one way in or out. As they moved deeper into the basement, the walls changed character, transitioning from worked stone to natural rock formations. The basement wasn't merely a constructed room, but an entrance to a cave system that extended beneath the town. The discovery suggested premeditation far beyond what they'd imagined. This wasn't just a hidden room, but an elaborate underground complex designed for a purpose neither wanted to contemplate. George's eye caught something glinting in the lantern light, a leather satchel sitting on a stone ledge, its brass buckle reflecting their light. Inside, they found letters dated from 15 years ago, all addressed to people with names they didn't recognize. But the handwriting looked fresh, the paper uncreased, as if someone had been down here recently, maintaining everything with careful precision. Seth picked up one of the pocket watches from a nearby shelf. Unlike the dust-covered objects above ground, it felt warm to the touch, its mechanism still working, despite being in what should have been a forgotten space for years. He opened the case, revealing the inscription inside. To Marcus, with love always, Elena. That name again, Georgia murmured, taking the watch carefully. Marcus? I heard it whispered in the general store, always followed by silence. She examined the timepiece more closely. This watch is still running, Seth. Someone's been winding it. The implications settled over them like a physical weight. Someone had been maintaining this space, preserving these belongings, keeping timepieces wound and letters uncreased. Not the actions of someone merely hiding evidence, but of someone tending to memories, or perhaps to guilt. Seth, look at this, Georgia whispered, holding up a small journal bound in cracked leather. Unlike the meticulously preserved letters, this item showed signs of frequent handling, its spine cracked from repeated opening, its pages dog-eared and smudged. The journal contained entries spanning 15 years, not from the distant past, but recent entries, some dated just weeks before they'd bought the property. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. They're asking questions again. Sarah's daughter came by the store. She's the same age now as Sarah was when I can't keep doing this. The guilt is consuming me. Above them, a board creaked near the trapdoor. Seth quickly replaced the watch and grabbed Georgia's hand, pulling her deeper into the basement where shadows might offer concealment. The stone walls seemed to stretch further than they'd first realized, disappearing into darkness that their lantern couldn't penetrate. As they moved cautiously forward, Georgia's foot struck something metallic. A lantern, recently used, still containing oil. The evidence confirmed their suspicion. Someone had been coming down here regularly, reading those journals, tending to those belongings like a twisted shrine. We need to get out of here, Georgia breathed, her academic curiosity now firmly overridden by survival instinct. The sound of scraping above told them someone was removing whatever had blocked the trapdoor. Moments later, light flooded down from the opening. Seth pulled Georgia deeper into the cave system, extinguishing their lantern to avoid detection. In the sudden darkness, other senses heightened. The drip of water from somewhere deeper in the caves, the musty scent of earth, and most alarmingly, the sound of someone descending the ladder into the basement. The beam of another lantern swept the area they'd just vacated. From their hiding place in a natural alcove, they could make out the silhouette of an elderly man moving with the familiarity of long habit. He checked the pocket watch first, winding it carefully before returning it to its place. Next, he straightened a woman's shawl that had slipped from its shelf, handling the fabric with something like reverence. Silas? A woman's voice called down from above. Is everything secure? The old man, Silas, looked up toward the opening. All fine, Mayor Collins. Just checking that nothing was disturbed. Be quick about it. The newcomers will be back soon. We need to decide what to do about them. Seth felt Georgia tense beside him. Mayor Collins, the same woman who'd avoided their gaze during the property signing, who'd hurried them through paperwork with barely concealed anxiety. Now they understood her discomfort. She knew what lay beneath the silver moon, knew what they might discover. We should have demolished this place years ago, the mayor continued, her voice drifting down clearly. Buried it all so deep no one would ever find it. You know why we couldn't, Silas replied, his tone suggesting an old argument. The cave system runs beneath half the town. Collapse one section, risk them all. And so we live with this memorial to our shame, Mayor Collins sighed. Hurry up. Town council meets in 20 minutes to discuss our options. The mention of options sent a chill through Seth. The casual way she'd said it suggested discussions not about property or reconstruction permits, but about them, the newcomers who discovered something they shouldn't have. Silas finished his inspection and climbed back up the ladder. The trapdoor closed once more, but this time they heard no sound of it being blocked. Perhaps in their haste, the visitors had forgotten to secure it, or perhaps they planned to return shortly. We need to find another way out, Seth whispered once the footsteps above faded. If that passage leads deeper under the town, it must emerge somewhere. Georgia nodded, though uncertainty clouded her features. What have we stumbled into, Seth? Those belongings, the journal entries, the mayor's involvement. This isn't just about a fire or a failed business. Seth reignited their lantern, keeping the flame low to minimize its visibility. I don't know exactly, but I'm starting to think that fire 3 years ago wasn't an accident. And whatever happened here, the entire town seems complicit in hiding it. They moved deeper into the cave system, Georgia mapping their turns in her notebook to ensure they could find their way back if necessary. The passage narrowed in places, widening into chambers in others. In one such chamber, Seth's light revealed something that stopped them both cold. Bones, human bones, partially buried in the soft earth of the cave floor. Not one set, but many, scattered throughout the chamber as if deposited there over time. Some showed signs of animal disturbance, others appeared deliberately arranged. Seth instinctively pulled Georgia back, shielding her from the grim discovery, but she gently pushed past him, her teacher's analytical mind already cataloging what they'd found. Different sizes, she noted quietly. Men, women, perhaps even children. And look, she pointed to a section of wall where more tally marks had been scratched, matching the ones they'd seen earlier. Someone was counting. The horrifying truth began to take shape. The Silver Moon hadn't just been a saloon. Something monstrous had happened here. Something the town had collectively decided to bury, figuratively and literally, beneath their feet. A sound from deeper in the cave system froze them both. The soft scrape of footsteps on stone. Someone else was down here with them, moving from deeper within rather than from the direction of the trapdoor. The footsteps stopped. Seth raised their lantern higher, its weak light barely reaching 10 feet ahead. "Hello?" Seth called out, his voice bouncing off stone walls. "We're trapped down here. Can you help us?" Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then a voice, elderly and broken, drifted from the shadows. "You shouldn't have bought this place. Told them to burn the deed with the rest of it." An old man stepped into their lantern light. His clothes were dusty but well-maintained, his face deeply lined with age and what appeared to be profound regret. Georgia recognized him from their brief time in town. Silas Crow, the man who'd sold them supplies for the renovation. The same man who'd been tending to the belongings moments ago. "Mr. Crow," Georgia said carefully, "how did you get down here? The entrance was blocked." "Been coming down here for 15 years, he replied, gesturing to a narrow passage they hadn't noticed. "Every week, making sure nothing gets disturbed. Making sure the truth stays buried where it belongs." Seth stepped closer, holding the journal they'd found. "What truth? Whose belongings are these?" Silas's eyes fixed on the journal with an expression of pure dread. "You read it, didn't you?" Sarah's final words. He sank onto a wooden crate, suddenly looking every one of his 70-odd years. She was so young, barely 18, had dreams of leaving this place, seeing the world beyond these hills. "What happened to her?" Georgia asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Same thing that happened to all of them," Silas said, his voice heavy with shame. "The Silver Moon wasn't just a saloon. Upstairs, behind locked doors, things happened that no decent person should know about. Young people would come seeking work, shelter. A fresh start, they'd disappear one by one." Seth felt sick as understanding dawned. Disappeared? How? The owner, Jameson Black, he had particular tastes. Silas's face contorted with disgust. When people got too curious, asked too many questions about missing friends or family members, they'd end up down here. George's hand flew to her mouth. "You're saying he killed them?" "Not just him," Silas admitted, shame evident in his hunched shoulders. "Half the town knew what was happening. Some participated, others just looked the other way. Too much money flowing through the Silver Moon to ask uncomfortable questions." Silas's voice cracked with self-loathing. "I was the town's carpenter back then. He paid me to reinforce this basement, make it deeper, more secure. Said it was for storage." He gestured at the bones visible in the chamber beyond. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a mass grave carefully concealed beneath the floorboards of a business that operated for years with the town's silent approval. "The fire," Seth said slowly, pieces falling into terrible alignment. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" Silas shook his head. Sarah's older brother finally came looking for her. Marcus, he nodded toward the pocket watch Seth had examined earlier. He'd been asking too many questions, getting close to the truth. Some of us decent folk, we couldn't live with it anymore. So you burned the place down, Georgia concluded, horror and understanding warring in her expression. With Jameson inside, who made sure he was inside when we did it, Silas confirmed grimly. And afterward, most folks left town, couldn't face what they'd allowed to happen. But some stayed, made a pact to never speak of it, to let the dead rest and the living try to find some peace. Seth's mind reeled at the implications. That's why everyone was so eager to sell us this place cheap. They hoped if someone bought it who didn't know the history, maybe the ghost would finally quiet down. But you've been coming down here for 15 years, Georgia said, studying the old man's face. Why? Because someone has to remember them, Silas said simply. Someone has to tend to their things, make sure they're not forgotten completely. It's the least I can do after helping create their tomb. From somewhere above them came the sound of multiple footsteps, heavy boots moving with purpose across the saloon floor. More people had arrived, and from the urgent whispers filtering down through the floorboards, they weren't happy about the discovery. We should have demolished this place years ago, a woman's voice, Mayor Collins, said firmly. I told you all this day would come. Silas moved toward the narrow passage he'd used to enter. That's Mayor Collins. She was the sheriff's wife back then, helped cover up the investigation. Investigation? Seth grabbed Silas's arm. The authorities knew? Boy, the authorities were some of the worst participants, Silas replied, bitterness seeping through every word. Sheriff Collins, Judge Morrison, even the preacher. They all had their fun upstairs while the killing happened down here. Why do you think nobody ever came looking for those missing people? Reports were never filed. Families were told their children had simply moved on. Above them, someone was trying to pry up floorboards. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the basement as they searched for the entrance to the hidden chamber. There's another way out, Silas whispered, leading them deeper into the passage. But you need to understand something first. If you leave this town knowing what you know, you'll never be safe. These people have kept this secret for 15 years. They've killed to protect it before. Georgia felt her legs trembling beneath her skirts. What are you saying? I'm saying you have two choices, Silas explained gravely. You can forget what you've seen, take your money, and leave town quietly. Or you can try to expose the truth and end up like the people whose belongings are arranged on those shelves. The passage led to a natural cave system that connected to several buildings in town. As they walked, Silas explained how the underground network had been used to transport victims without being seen. The Silver Moon had been chosen specifically because of these caves. Jameson Black wasn't even from here originally, Silas continued, guiding them through a particularly narrow section. He came to town about 20 years ago with money and big plans, built the Silver Moon right over this cave system, said he wanted to create the finest establishment in the territory, but he was planning this from the beginning. Seth realized the implications immediately. The disappearances started small, didn't they? Drifters, people passing through, nobody to miss them or ask questions. That's right, Silas nodded. But then he got bolder, started targeting locals. That's when some of us began to get nervous. They emerged through a concealed entrance behind the town's church. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, escaping evil through a place meant for salvation. Georgia looked back toward the Silver Moon and saw lanterns moving inside, searching desperately for any trace of their discovery. The journal mentioned Sarah's daughter, Georgia said, remembering the entries. She's still alive? Silas nodded grimly. Lives 2 towns over. Comes by sometimes asking about her mother. People tell her Sarah moved east, married some rancher. The woman's been searching for 15 years, never knowing her mother's bones are scattered in that cave system. Seth felt a surge of determination. She deserves to know the truth. The truth will get her killed, Silas replied bluntly, just like it'll get you killed if you're not careful. These people didn't survive 15 years of secret keeping by being merciful to threats. From the direction of the Silver Moon came the sound of horses approaching fast, multiple riders moving with the organized urgency of a search party. Mayor Collins had clearly decided that Seth and Georgia posed too great a risk to ignore. They're coming for us, Silas said, his aged face etched with fear. And when they find us, they'll make sure we join the others down in that basement. That's how this town deals with people who know too much. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the search party spread out across the town. Georgia could see lanterns bobbing between buildings as they systematically checked every possible hiding place. These people knew the town intimately and had experience tracking down those who threatened their secret. "There's a wagon behind the church," Silas whispered. "If we can reach it without being seen, we might make it to the county line before they organize a proper hunt." Seth helped Georgia climb into the wagon bed, covering them both with a tarp that smelled of hay and horse sweat. Silas took the driver's seat, keeping his movements calm and natural despite the urgency of their situation. As they rolled slowly through the back streets, Georgia heard familiar voices calling their names. The baker who'd sold them bread that morning. The hotel owner who'd seemed so friendly when they'd first arrived. People who'd smiled and welcomed them to town now hunted them like animals. "Stop right there, Silas," came a commanding voice. Mayor Collins stepped into the street ahead of them, flanked by two men Georgia recognized as town council members. Behind them, more figures emerged from the shadows, effectively surrounding the wagon. Silas reined in the horses, his hands steady despite the danger. "Evening, Mayor. Just heading out to check on my livestock." Mayor Collins was a sharp woman in her 50s, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. "With passengers hidden under that tarp? We know they're with you, Silas. We found their footprints leading from the church." "I don't know what you're talking about," Silas replied, but his voice carried no conviction. 15 years we've all lived with this burden," the mayor continued, stepping closer to the wagon. 15 years of nightmares and guilt, but we've also had 15 years of peace. Our children grew up safe. Our businesses prospered. The town moved forward. Under the tarp, Seth felt George's hand grip his arm. They could hear everything, including the sound of more people gathering around the wagon. "Those people deserve justice," Silas said quietly. "Those people are dead," Mayor Collins snapped. "Justice won't bring them back. But exposing this now will destroy the lives of everyone who's left. Children who don't know what their parents did. Families who've spent 15 years trying to make amends through honest living." "And Sarah's daughter," Silas challenged. "Doesn't she deserve to know what happened to her mother?" "Sarah's daughter has built a life for herself," Mayor Collins replied, her voice softening slightly. "She has children of her own now, a husband who loves her. Do you really want to destroy that peace by telling her that her mother was tortured and killed by her own neighbors?" The moral complexity of the situation hit Seth like a physical blow. These weren't just criminals trying to escape justice. They were an entire community that had made a collective decision to bury a horrific chapter of their history and move forward. "The thing is," Mayor Collins continued, "we can't let you leave knowing what you know, but we also can't have any more blood on our hands. So we're prepared to make you an offer." She gestured to one of the men beside her, who produced a leather satchel heavy with coins. $5,000, more than enough to buy land anywhere you want to settle. All you have to do is forget you ever came to this town. "And if we refuse?" Seth called out from under the tarp. Mayor Collins sighed deeply. "Then you'll join the others in that basement, and we'll tell anyone who comes a-looking that you left town in the middle of the night, just like all the others." Georgia felt her heart racing. They were trapped between accepting complicity in a massive cover-up or facing certain death. The weight of over 100 lives hung in the balance, along with the question of whether exposing old crimes was worth destroying an entire community that had tried to rebuild itself. "You have until dawn to decide," Mayor Collins said, stepping back from the wagon. "Silas knows where to find us with your answer." Her voice hardened. "Choose wisely." Silas drove them to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where they sat around a flickering candle, trying to process the impossible choice they faced. The leather satchel of money sat on the table between them like a moral test, its contents representing more wealth than Seth and Georgia had ever seen. "Tell me about Sarah's daughter," Georgia said quietly. "What's her name?" Silas stared into the candle flame. Emma Richardson now. She married a good man, has 3 children, lives in Cedar Falls, runs a small school for the local children. Every few months, she writes letters to people in town asking if anyone has heard from her mother. And everyone lies to her," Seth said, disgust evident in his voice. Everyone protects her from a truth that would destroy everything she's built, Silas corrected. Her children call her the strongest woman they know. She raised herself from nothing, thinking her mother abandoned her. What would it do to her to learn that her mother died screaming in that basement? Georgia felt tears burning her eyes. But she's living with a lie. Her whole life is built on not knowing the truth about the person who gave her life. Sometimes lies are kinder than truth, Silas said, though his voice carried no conviction. That's what we've all told ourselves for 15 years. That letting sleeping dogs lie was the merciful thing to do. Seth picked up one of the gold coins from the satchel. It was real, solid, enough to start over anywhere they wanted. After years of drought and financial struggle, it represented security, a fresh start, freedom from worry. All they had to do was walk away from justice for 118 souls. What happens to the other families, Georgia asked, the ones still searching for their missing relatives? Most stopped searching years ago, Silas admitted. Death or acceptance, hard to tell which. But there are still a few who write letters, hire investigators when they can afford it, all chasing ghosts because we've hidden the bodies too well. The weight of their decision pressed down on them like the stone ceiling of that hidden basement. If they took the money and left, they'd be complicit in perpetuating the suffering of families who deserved answers. If they stayed to fight for justice, they'd likely end up as the next addition to that grim collection of personal belongings. There's something else you need to know, Silas said reluctantly, about why they're so desperate to keep this quiet now, after all these years. Georgia looked up from the satchel. What do you mean? Last month, a federal marshal came through town, Silas explained, said he was investigating a pattern of disappearances across the territory. Someone's been tracking missing persons reports from 15 to 20 years ago, looking for connections. Seth felt a surge of hope. The government knows. That marshal asked specifically about the silver moon, about the fire, about why so many people seemed to leave town around the same time, Silas continued. If this story comes out now, it won't just destroy the people who participated. It'll bring federal investigators down on everyone. The candle flickered as a night breeze swept through the cabin. In the dancing shadows, Georgia could almost see the faces of those 118 victims, waiting for someone to finally speak for them. The marshal left his card with the hotel owner, Silas continued, said if anyone remembered anything unusual from that time period, they should contact him immediately. Hotel owner burned the card that same night. So we're not the only threat they're facing, Georgia realized. The whole cover-up is starting to unravel. Silas nodded grimly, which means they're more dangerous now than they have ever been. Desperate people do desperate things, and these folks have already proven they're willing to kill to protect their secret. Outside, they could hear riders moving through the darkness, maintaining their search. Even as dawn approached, time was running out for Seth and Georgia to make their choice. The first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin windows, illuminating the three faces gathered around the table. Seth's determined, Georgia's troubled, Silas is resigned. The satchel of money sat untouched, its temptation diminished by hours of moral wrestling. Seth stood abruptly, pushing the satchel across the table toward Silas. We can't take this. Those people deserve justice, even if it comes 15 years too late. You're signing your own death warrant, Silas warned, though something like relief flickered in his eyes. They won't let you leave town alive, not knowing what you know. Georgia reached into her coat and pulled out the journal they'd found in the basement. Then we need to make sure this information gets out before they can stop us. You said there was a federal marshal investigating. How do we contact him? His name was Marshal William Hayes, Silas replied. He was heading north toward the territorial capital when he left here. But even if you could reach him, what proof do you have? A basement full of old belongings and the word of 3 people against an entire town. Seth had been thinking about this through the long night. The bodies, Silas. You said they were scattered through the cave system. That's evidence that can't be disputed. Bodies that have been down there for 15 years, Silas countered. Scattered by animals, buried under rockfalls. Even if we could find them, there wouldn't be enough left to prove how they died. Georgia opened the journal to a page she'd marked earlier. But this isn't just Sarah's writing. Look at these entries. Different handwriting styles, Different ink. Other victims wrote in this journal before they died. They documented what was happening to them. Silas leaned forward, studying the pages more carefully. You're right, I never looked at it closely before. Too painful. But these are accounts from multiple people written while they were imprisoned down there. Testimony from beyond the grave. If we can get this journal to the federal authorities, Seth said, hope kindling in his voice, along with our first-hand account of what we found, they'll have to investigate. The people upstairs won't let you get that far, Silas replied. They're organized. They know the territory, and they have 15 years of practice at making problems disappear. Outside, they could hear horses approaching the cabin, multiple riders moving with the systematic pattern of a well-organized search. Seth peered through a gap in the curtains and counted at least 8 people surrounding the building. Time's up, came Mayor Collins's voice from outside. We know you're in there, Silas. Send them out so we can discuss this reasonably. Georgia clutched the journal to her chest. Is there another way out of here? Silas shook his head. This cabin was built for honest living, not for hiding from neighbors. But there might be another option. He moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a small space underneath. It's not much, but it might hide the journal if things go badly. Silas, Mayor Collins called again, her patience clearly wearing thin. You've got 30 seconds to open that door before we come in ourselves. Seth took the journal from Georgia and wrapped it carefully in an oilcloth before placing it in the hiding spot. If we don't make it out of this, that journal is the only voice those victims have left. You're making a mistake, Silas said, but he was already replacing the floorboard. But maybe it's a mistake that needed to be made 15 years ago. The cabin door burst open as armed men flooded inside. Mayor Collins entered behind them, her face set in grim determination. I had hoped you'd choose wisdom over righteousness, she said, looking at the empty satchel on the table. But I see you've decided to join the others after all. People will come looking for us, Georgia said, though she wasn't sure it was true. People came looking for all the others too, Mayor Collins replied sadly. We got very good at explaining why folks decide to move on suddenly. Pack up in the night, head for better opportunities out west. Seth stepped protectively in front of Georgia. A federal marshal is already investigating. When we disappear too, he'll know something's wrong. Mayor Collins smiled, but it was a cold expression without warmth. Marshal Hayes met with an unfortunate accident on the trail north of here. Bandits, very tragic. His investigation died with him. The revelation about Marshal Hayes hit Seth like a physical blow. These people hadn't just killed over 100 innocent victims 15 years ago. They were still killing anyone who threatened to expose their secret. The scope of their conspiracy was far more extensive than he'd imagined. You killed a federal marshal, Georgia whispered, her voice filled with horror. We protected our community, Mayor Collins corrected firmly. Just like we've been doing for 15 years. Every difficult choice we've made has been to preserve the lives and futures of innocent people who had nothing to do with Jameson Black's crimes. But you all knew what was happening, Seth argued. You all allowed it to continue. Some of us were cowards, Mayor Collins admitted. Others were victims themselves. Jameson Black didn't just prey on drifters and travelers. He blackmailed half the town council, threatened their families, used their secrets against them. When we finally found the courage to stop him, we burned everything to the ground. Silas spoke up from where the armed men held him. Tell them about Judge Morrison's daughter. Tell them what Jameson threatened to do to her if the judge didn't cooperate. Mayor Collins's composure cracked slightly. Judge Morrison was a good man trapped in an impossible situation. His choices were to participate in Jameson's cover-ups or watch his 12-year-old daughter become the next victim. What would you have done? The moral complexity of the situation made Seth's head spin. These weren't simply evil people protecting their crimes. They were a community that had been terrorized by a monster. And when they'd finally destroyed him, they'd chosen to protect themselves and their families by burying the evidence of their victimization. But the families of the victims, Georgia said desperately, they've spent 15 years wondering, searching, hoping their loved ones might still be alive somewhere. And we've spent 15 years building a community where children can grow up safely, Mayor Collins replied, where families can prosper without fear. Sometimes the greater good requires terrible sacrifices. One of the armed men stepped forward, a man Georgia recognized as the town doctor. Mayor, we need to make this quick. There are travelers expected through town this afternoon. We can't afford witnesses. Mayor Collins nodded reluctantly. Take them to the Silver Moon. Make it look like they fell through the damaged floorboards into the basement. An unfortunate accident during their renovation attempts. As the men moved to escort Seth and Georgia outside, Silas made his move. Despite his age, he lunged forward and grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace, swinging it wildly at the nearest captor. "Run!" he shouted. "Get to the journal!" The cabin erupted in chaos. Seth tackled one of the men while Georgia dove for the loose floorboard where they'd hidden the evidence. Silas fought with the desperate strength of a man who'd carried guilt for 15 years and finally saw a chance at redemption. "The journal!" Georgia shouted, clutching the wrap package to her chest. "Seth, I have it!" But their victory was short-lived. Mayor Collins drew a pistol from her coat, pointing it directly at Silas. "Enough," she said quietly. "Put down the poker, old man, or I'll put you out of your misery right here." Silas lowered the makeshift weapon, his chest heaving from exertion. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead where someone had struck him. 15 years I've regretted not doing the right thing," he gasped. "I won't make that mistake again." "Then you'll die for nothing," Mayor Collins said sadly, "because that journal will burn with the rest of you, and Sarah's daughter will never know the truth about her mother." Outside, more riders were approaching. The sound of hoofbeats suggested a much larger group this time, as if the entire remaining population of the town was converging on Silas's cabin to participate in this final cover-up. The hoofbeats outside grew louder, but something was different about their rhythm. Instead of the organized approach of the town's search party, these riders moved with military precision. Seth heard shouted commands and voices he didn't recognize, authoritative and urgent. Mayor Collins frowned, moving to the window. Her face went pale as she peered outside. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Federal marshals," came a booming voice from outside. "Surround the building! Nobody moves until we sort this out." The cabin door burst open again, but this time uniformed federal officers poured inside instead of townspeople. Leading them was a tall man with a badge pinned to his leather vest and eyes that missed nothing as he surveyed the scene. "Marshal William Hayes," he announced, causing Mayor Collins to stagger backward in shock. "And before you ask, no, I'm not dead, though your people certainly tried their best to arrange that." Seth felt a surge of hope so intense it nearly buckled his knees. The marshal they'd thought was dead was very much alive, and he'd brought reinforcements. "The ambush on the North Trail was well planned," Marshal Hayes continued, his voice hard as granite. "But you made one mistake. You assumed I was traveling alone. My partner made it back to the territorial capital with a full report of what happened here." Mayor Collins tried to regain her composure. "Marshal, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but this is a peaceful community. These people broke into private property." "Ma'am," Hayes interrupted, "we've been investigating this territory for 8 months. We have statements from families in 6 different towns about missing relatives who were last seen heading toward your community. We have testimonies from survivors who escaped similar operations in other territories. And now we have witnesses to your current activities." He gestured towards Silas. "This man sent word to the territorial capital 3 days ago through a traveling merchant, described what these folks found in that basement, and requested federal assistance on their behalf. That's why we're here." Georgia looked at Silas in amazement. Despite his claims of complicity and 15 years of guilt, the old man had found the courage to finally do the right thing. He'd secretly contacted the authorities while pretending to help the town cover up their discovery. "The evidence is already in federal hands," Marshal Hayes continued. "We excavated that basement yesterday while you were all busy hunting these people. Found enough remains to confirm what we suspected. This was a systematic operation that murdered over 100 innocent people." Mayor Collins's pistol trembled in her hand. "You don't understand the full situation. Marshal Jameson Black was the real criminal. We were his victims too. Everything we did was to protect our families from him." "I understand perfectly, ma'am," Hayes replied calmly, "and those circumstances will be taken into account during the trials. But vigilante justice, even against a monster like Black, doesn't give you the right to cover up mass murder for 15 years, doesn't give you the right to kill a federal marshal. We thought we killed you, Mayor Collins said weakly. You killed my horse and destroyed my supplies, Hayes corrected. Took me 3 days to walk back to civilization, long enough to organize a proper response to what I discovered here. Seth unwrapped the journal and handed it to Marshal Hayes. This contains first-hand accounts from multiple victims. They documented what was happening to them before they died. Hayes accepted the journal with reverence, understanding its significance. This will help ensure that every victim gets justice, even if it came too late to save them. Mayor Collins finally lowered her pistol, the weight of 15 years of secrets and guilt finally breaking her resolve. What happens to us now? To our children? Our families? That will be determined by a judge and jury, Hayes replied. But I can tell you that cooperation now will be viewed more favorably than continued resistance. As federal officers began arresting the town's people involved in the cover-up, Seth put his arm around George's shoulders. They had survived, and more importantly, they had ensured that the victims of the Silver Moon would finally receive the justice they deserved. The truth had been buried for 15 years, but it had finally come to light. Sarah's daughter would learn what happened to her mother. The other families would finally have answers. And a community that had built itself on silence and complicity would face the consequences of their choices. Seth and Georgia stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as the first true light of day spread across the town. Whatever future awaited them now, they would face it together, knowing they had chosen justice over self-interest, truth over comfortable lies. Some burdens were too heavy to bear alone, and some secrets were never meant to stay buried. The morning air carried the mingled sense of wood smoke and tension as federal marshals established a perimeter around Silas's cabin. Seth and Georgia stood on the porch, watching the methodical efficiency with which Hayes's men secured Mayor Collins and her conspirators. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across a town whose darkest secrets lay exposed to the harsh light of day. Hayes approached them, his weathered face etched with grim satisfaction. We'll need detailed statements from both of you. Everything you saw in that basement. Everything Silas and the mayor told you. Leave nothing out, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Georgia's fingers tightened around the leather-bound journal she'd rescued from beneath the floorboards. The weight of Sarah's final words, along with those of countless other victims, felt heavier than the physical object itself. What happens now? To the town? To the people involved? Justice happens, Hayes answered, watching as his deputies led the town doctor and 2 council members toward waiting horses. Though it rarely looks the way we expect it to. Seth surveyed the cluster of townspeople gathering at a distance, their expressions ranging from fear to relief. Some had clearly been complicit in the conspiracy, others seemed genuinely shocked at the revelations unfolding before them. Not everyone knew, did they? There must be innocent people here, people who moved in after the fire, children who had no part in this. That's why we're being methodical, Hayes explained. Separating witnesses from accessories, coerced participants from willing conspirators. It'll take time to untangle 15 years of silence. A deputy approached with urgent news, his voice low but carrying enough for Seth to catch fragments. Townspeople gathering, some armed, near the Silver Moon. Hayes straightened, instantly alert. Get the prisoners secure, double the guard. I want teams of 3 at every approach to this cabin. He turned back to Seth and Georgia. The mayor's supporters are organizing. We need to move you somewhere safer until we can get additional reinforcements. The cabin that had seemed like sanctuary hours before now felt exposed, vulnerable to the gathering storm of a town desperate to protect its secrets. Hayes dispatched riders north toward the territorial capital, carrying urgent requests for additional marshals and formal arrest warrants for those not yet in custody. We're taking you to the church, Hayes decided. Defensible position, stone walls, clear sight lines. My men will escort you. Stay close, eyes open. The walk through town felt interminable. Every window potentially concealing hostile eyes. Every alleyway a possible ambush point. The marshals formed a protective barrier around Seth and Georgia, weapons ready but not drawn, a delicate balance between preparedness and provocation. As they passed the general store, a woman emerged, clutching a young child to her chest. She locked eyes with Jonah, her expression a complex mixture of fear and something that might have been gratitude. They took my sister 10 years ago, her voice barely above a whisper. Told me she'd run off with a cattle driver. I never believed it. Before Georgia could respond, the woman had disappeared back inside. But the brief encounter revealed an important truth. Not everyone in town had embraced the conspiracy of silence. Some had nursed private doubts, harbored quiet suspicions, perhaps even mourned loved ones while surrounded by their killers. The church stood at the town's northern edge, its simple stone construction offering both practical protection and symbolic irony. A place meant for confession and redemption now served as fortress against those who'd rejected both. Inside, Hayes quickly organized his men, positioning sharpshooters in the bell tower and establishing defensive positions at each entrance. We're outnumbered for now, but reinforcements should arrive by nightfall. Until then, we hold this position and gather evidence. Seth paced the narrow confines of the pastor's study where Hayes had installed them for safety. We can't just wait here, there's too much at stake. Those records in the basement, the bodies in the cave system, what if they destroy the evidence before your reinforcements arrive? I've already sent men to secure the Silver Moon, Hayes assured him. We removed critical evidence during the night, while the town was busy searching for Yoel. The journal you recovered is the final piece we needed to build an irrefutable case. Georgia sat by the window, watching townspeople gathering in small groups, their hushed conversations punctuated by occasional glances toward the church. They looked confused, afraid. I wonder how many truly understood what happened at the Silver Moon, and how many simply chose not to ask uncomfortable questions. That's the nature of collective guilt, Hayes observed. It distributes the weight until no one person feels responsible for carrying it. Makes it easier to live with yourself, knowing others share your burden. A commotion outside drew their attention. A middle-aged woman approached the church alone, hands raised to show she carried no weapons. One of Hayes's deputies intercepted her at the gate, conducting a thorough search before escorting her inside. Hayes met her in the church's main hall, keeping Seth and Georgia safely out of sight but within earshot. Mrs. Winters, I understand you have information for us. The woman's voice trembled with nervous energy. My husband was Judge Morrison's clerk before the fire. He kept records, copies of documents that were supposed to be filed with territorial authorities. Missing persons reports that never made it beyond our town limits. Death certificates with falsified causes. He knew it was wrong, but Jameson Black threatened our son. Hayes's tone remained measured, neither accusatory nor sympathetic. Why come forward now, after 15 years of silence? Because he died with those secrets. Her voice cracked slightly. Consumption took him 3 winters ago. On his deathbed, he made me promise that if the truth ever started to emerge, I wouldn't stand in its way. The documents are hidden in our root cellar. I can take your men there. Hayes dispatched 2 deputies to accompany Mrs. Winters, his instructions explicit. Full documentation, chain of custody procedures. I want every page accounted for and secured. As they departed, Seth moved closer to Georgia, lowering his voice. Do you think she's telling the truth, or is this some elaborate trap? Georgia considered the question carefully. The fear in her eyes seemed genuine. Not fear of us or the marshals, but of her neighbors, the people she's been living alongside all these years, knowing what they'd done. Hayes rejoined them, his expression guarded. We'll know soon enough. In the meantime, I need to hear everything Silas told you about Sarah's daughter. Emma, was it? If she's due to visit town next week, we need to intercept her before she walks into this situation unprepared. Georgia recounted what little they knew. Emma Richardson, now a school teacher in Cedar Falls, mother of 3, periodically searching for the mother she believed had abandoned her. Silas said she writes letters every few months, asking if anyone has heard from Sarah. Everyone lies to her, tells her they haven't heard anything. Hayes made quick calculations. Cedar Falls is 2 days' ride. If she's planning to visit next week, she'd likely depart within the next day or 2. We need to send someone immediately. Seth offered immediately. Let me go. Georgia can provide her testimony here while I ride to Cedar Falls. Hayes shook his head firmly. I need both of you here. Your first-hand accounts of discovering the basement, your interactions with Silas and Mayor Collins. These details are crucial to building our case. He summoned his youngest deputy, a serious-faced man in his late 20s. Chambers, I need you to ride for Cedar Falls today. Find Emma Richardson and explain the situation as gently as possible. She deserves to hear this from someone with compassion, not from gossip or newspapers. As Hayes drafted a letter for Deputy Chambers to carry, Georgia felt a weight settle across her shoulders, the responsibility of truth-telling. Sarah's journal contained details no mother would want her daughter to read, accounts of suffering no child should have to imagine their parent enduring. Yet denying Emma the truth meant perpetuating the lies she'd built her life around. Sometimes mercy requires truth, however painful, Georgia murmured, more to herself than to Seth. She deserves to know her mother never abandoned her. Deputy Chambers departed within the hour, riding hard for Cedar Falls with Hayes's letter and strict instructions to approach Emma Richardson with both honesty and sensitivity. As they watched him disappear down the northern road, Hayes turned his attention to the immediate threat, a town increasingly hostile to the federal presence in their midst. From the bell tower, a marshal reported growing gatherings at the Silver Moon and Town Hall. Not openly armed confrontation yet, but the potential simmered beneath tense conversations and furtive glances. Hayes dispatched riders to the nearest military outpost, requesting additional support. The church had become an island of federal authority in a sea of local resistance. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Seth and Georgia provided detailed statements, recounting every moment from their discovery of the trapdoor to their dramatic rescue that morning. Hayes recorded their testimony meticulously, occasionally requesting clarification on specific details, the exact arrangement of belongings in the basement, the precise wording of Mayor Collins's threats, the locations of bodies they'd glimpsed in the cave system. Your testimonies align perfectly with Silas's correspondence, Hayes noted, reviewing his notes. He'd been writing to federal authorities for years, though most dismissed his letters as the ramblings of a guilt-ridden old man. I received my first communication from him 3 months ago, vague references to sins buried beneath the Silver Moon. When I arrived to investigate, he provided more concrete details, enough to justify a formal inquiry. Seth leaned forward, curiosity overcoming fatigue. If Silas contacted you months ago, why wait until now to act? How many more might have been saved if you'd moved sooner? Hayes accepted the implicit criticism without defensiveness. Marshal service procedures require substantial evidence before initiating an investigation that could destabilize an entire community. Silas provided names and approximate dates, but no physical evidence. It wasn't until I began connecting his information with missing persons reports from surrounding territories that the pattern became clear enough to justify action. The practical limitations of justice landed heavily on Seth's conscience. How many families had continued searching while federal bureaucracy processed paperwork and verified claims? How many had given up hope in the intervening months? A commotion outside interrupted his brooding. One of Hayes's deputies entered the church, escorting a familiar figure, Silas Crow, his face bruised, but his eyes clear with purpose. Hayes had ordered him held separately from the other prisoners, both for his protection and to continue gathering information. They're planning something, Silas announced without preamble. The remaining council members, the deputy sheriff, Judge Peterson, they've called an emergency town meeting at sunset, claiming federal overreach, violation of local authority. Hayes absorbed this information with practiced calm. Expected, they'll try to present this as outside interference rather than the exposure of mass murder. Who among them holds the most influence? Who will the townspeople follow if this escalates to violence? Judge Peterson, Silas replied immediately. Respected, seemingly above reproach. Most folks don't know how deeply involved he was with Jameson's operation. He authorized falsified death certificates, dismissed inquiries from families searching for missing relatives, used his position to bury official investigations before they could start. Georgia studied Silas's bruised face, noting the split lip and darkening eye. What happened to you? Some of the mayor's supporters expressed their displeasure with my change of allegiance. Silas touched his swollen jaw gingerly. Small price to pay for 15 years of cowardice. Hayes dispatched additional men to observe the town meeting discreetly, with strict orders to avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary. As sunset approached, an uneasy quiet settled over the church, the breathless anticipation before a storm breaks. The deputies returned as darkness fell, their report confirming Silas's warning. Judge Peterson had effectively taken command, portraying the federal intervention as an attack on the town's sovereignty. He'd carefully framed the narrative around protecting current residents rather than accounting for past crimes, emphasizing the potential destruction of innocent families if the full truth emerged. He's calling for resistance, the deputy reported. Not open warfare, but obstruction, denying access to witnesses, concealing evidence, presenting a united front against outsiders who don't understand our community's complex history. Hayes's expression hardened. Complicated history. That's what they were calling the systematic murder of over 100 people. He turned to Seth in Georgia. You need to understand what we're facing. This won't be a simple case of arresting the guilty and delivering justice. We're confronting a community that's built its identity around a shared secret. Some were willing participants, others coerced, many simply looked away, but all benefited from the silence. The moral complexity of the situation settled over them like a physical weight. These weren't cartoon villains twirling mustaches, but ordinary people who had made a series of increasingly terrible choices, then constructed elaborate justifications to live with themselves afterward. As night deepened, Hayes received word that the deputies sent with Mrs. Winters had returned with a substantial cache of documents, records meticulously copied and preserved by her late husband. Birth certificates, death reports, correspondence between town officials and territorial authorities, all providing a paper trail of the conspiracy's administrative apparatus. This changes everything, Hayes murmured, reviewing the documents by lamplight. Names, dates, official signatures. Judge Morrison's involvement is extensively documented, along with Sheriff Collins, Mayor Collins before she took office, and half the town council. Jameson Black maintained financial records of payments to each of them, bribes, blackmail, profit sharing from his enterprise. Seth examined a ledger showing regular payments to town officials spanning nearly a decade. They weren't just covering up his crimes, they were profiting from them. Some were, Hayes agreed. Others were clearly coerced through threats to family members. Morrison's daughter is mentioned repeatedly as leverage. Several council members had similar vulnerabilities Jameson exploited. Georgia found herself drawn to the death certificates, dozens of them, each bearing Judge Morrison's signature, each listing causes like pneumonia or accident while traveling for young people who had actually died in the Silver Moon's basement. The clinical bureaucracy of evil chilled her more deeply than the visceral horror of the basement itself. How do you judge different types of guilt? She wondered aloud. The man who signs a false death certificate seems less monstrous than the one who inflicts the death, yet without the certificate, the killing might have been discovered and stopped. Hayes had no simple answer. That's for the courts to determine. Our job is to gather evidence, apprehend suspects, and ensure victims receive recognition and, where possible, proper burial. He hesitated before adding, though I'll admit, in 15 years with the Marshal Service, I've never encountered a case where the line between perpetrator and victim blurs so consistently. The arrival of 2 more marshals from a neighboring county brought welcome reinforcement but no significant change to their tactical situation. They remained outnumbered, surrounded by a community increasingly united against them. Hayes gathered his deputies for a strategy session, outlining plans to secure additional sites within town, particularly the records office, where more evidence might be found, and the Silver Moon itself, where the excavation of remains would need to continue under guard. Dawn operation, he instructed. Simultaneous movement to both locations. I want overwhelming force, no hesitation, no shots fired unless absolutely necessary. These people need to face justice in a courtroom, not a firefight. As the marshals dispersed to prepare, Georgia found herself drawn to the church's small library. The pastor's collection reflected conventional religious texts alongside philosophical treatises on morality and ethics. She selected a volume on communal responsibility, turning pages by lamplight while Seth dozed fitfully nearby. A passage caught her attention. The greatest evil perpetrated is that which transforms ordinary people into willing participants through incremental moral compromise. Each small step seems defensible in isolation. The horror becomes apparent only when viewed in its totality. The words resonated with everything they'd learned about the Silver Moon and the town that had protected its secrets. Jameson Black hadn't operated in isolation. He'd created a system that implicated others, distributing guilt so widely that no single person carried enough to prompt confession. Dawn arrived with unexpected calm. Hayes's men moved efficiently to secure the targeted locations, meeting minimal resistance. Most townspeople remained indoors. Whether from fear, shame, or simple uncertainty remained unclear. Judge Peterson and his closest allies had apparently spent the night deliberating strategy rather than organizing immediate opposition. By mid-morning, Hayes had established a secure perimeter around the Silver Moon. Work crews began the grim task of excavating and documenting remains from the basement and cave system, each set of bones representing a person with a name, a history, a family still waiting for answers. Seth and Georgia accompanied Hayes to observe the process, their status shifting from witnesses to something approaching deputies as the investigation progressed. The basement appeared transformed in daylight, with federal marshals methodically cataloging each personal belonging, recording its position, searching for any identifying marks. "We'll try to match possessions to remains where possible," Hayes explained. "Give families something tangible to bury alongside their loved ones. It's little enough comfort, but sometimes small mercies are all we can offer." The systematic approach struck Georgia as both necessary and profoundly inadequate. Scientific documentation couldn't capture the horror of what had happened here. Young people lured with promises of opportunity, imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately disposed of like waste. The clinical precision of the investigation seemed almost disrespectful to the chaotic terror the victims must have experienced. As if reading her thoughts, Hayes added quietly, "This part feels coldly mechanical, I know, but proper documentation ensures trials can proceed based on evidence rather than emotion. These victims deserve justice delivered through law, not vengeance delivered through violence." Their work was interrupted by a deputy's urgent approach. "Marshal, we've got movement at the town hall. Looks like Judge Peterson is addressing a crowd." Larger gathering than last night, more openly hostile rhetoric. Hayes signaled to his second-in-command, "Keep the excavation team working. Double the guard here and at the records office." To Seth in Georgia, he added, "I need to assess this situation personally. You should return to the church where it's safer." Seth squared his shoulders, newfound purpose evident in his stance. "With respect, Marshal, we're as invested in seeing this through as anyone. We discovered this place. We faced Mayor Collins's threats. We won't hide while others finish what we started." Hayes studied them both, measuring resolve against risk before nodding curtly. "Stay behind me. Follow instructions immediately if trouble starts. And remember, these are desperate people protecting what they believe is their way of life." The scene at the town hall confirmed the deputy's report. Judge Peterson stood on the steps, addressing nearly 200 townspeople, a substantial portion of the remaining population. His commanding presence and carefully measured rhetoric transformed what might have been a chaotic mob into something more dangerous, an organized resistance with moral conviction. "Not denying that terrible things happened at the Silver Moon," Peterson was saying as they approached. "Jameson Black was a monster who exploited and corrupted our community. When his crimes became too terrible to bear, brave citizens took action, ending his reign of terror the only way they could." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Peterson continued, his voice strengthening. "But now, 15 years later, federal authorities wish to punish the survivors, the very people who stopped Black's atrocities. They would destroy families, orphan children, bankrupt businesses, all to satisfy their need for someone to blame." Hayes moved purposefully toward the gathering, his deputies flanking him in a show of federal authority. The crowd parted reluctantly, hostile eyes tracking their progress. Judge Peterson faltered momentarily upon seeing them, then recovered with practiced composure. "Marshal Hayes," he acknowledged with false cordiality, "come to hear the concerns of the community you're so eager to dismantle." Hayes ascended several steps, positioning himself just below Peterson, close enough to establish authority without creating the appearance of physically threatening the judge. "I've come to remind you that interfering with a federal investigation is a serious crime, one you're currently committing by encouraging obstruction." Peterson smiled thinly. Sharing concerns with my neighbors constitutes no crime, Marshal. We're simply discussing how best to cooperate while protecting innocent parties from being swept up in your zealous pursuit of justice. The verbal sparring continued, each man careful to maintain a facade of civility while essentially threatening the other. Georgia observed the crowd's reactions, noting the varying expressions, outright hostility from some, fearful uncertainty from others, and from a significant minority, what appeared to be genuine relief that long-buried secrets were finally facing exposure. A commotion at the edge of the gathering drew her attention. Several women had arrived together, their expressions resolute rather than angry. One stepped forward, her gray hair and lined face suggesting someone who had witnessed the town's entire tragic history. Judge Peterson speaks of protecting families. Her voice carried surprisingly well for her age. But what of my family? My daughter Elizabeth disappeared from this town 17 years ago. When I came searching, Sheriff Collins told me she'd moved on to California. I found her hairpin in that basement yesterday alongside dozens of other belongings. Who protected her family? Who protected any of them? The intervention created a ripple effect through the crowd. Others stepped forward, visiting relatives of the missing, townspeople who had harbored private doubts for years, even a few who admitted to minor roles in the conspiracy and now sought to unburden themselves. Judge Peterson attempted to regain control of the narrative, his voice rising with authority born of decades on the bench. These are isolated tragedies, not evidence of widespread complicity. Jameson Black operated in secret, concealing his true activities from most of us until it was too late. That's a lie, another voice countered. The town doctor, now in custody but permitted to address the gathering under guard. We all knew something terrible was happening at the Silver Moon. Some participated directly, others provided administrative cover, most simply chose not to question why so many strangers passed through our town but never left. We bear different degrees of guilt, but none of us can claim true ignorance. The crowd's unified resistance began fracturing visibly, neighbors turning to one another with accusations and defenses, long-maintained facades crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. Hayes allowed the process to unfold without interference, recognizing that community self-examination might accomplish what external force could not. Judge Peterson made a final attempt to salvage his position. Whatever happened in the past, we've built something worthwhile here. 15 years of peace, prosperity, children raised without fear. Would you sacrifice all that for abstract justice that can't restore a single life? Peace built on buried bodies isn't peace at all, Seth called out, unable to remain silent any longer. It's just a prettier version of the same corruption that allowed the killing to happen in the first place. Peterson's facade finally cracked, righteous indignation giving way to naked fear. You have no idea what Jameson Black was capable of. The threats he made, the leverage he held over each of us. What would you have done in our position? Anything but this, Georgia answered simply. Anything but 15 years of lies while families search for children they'll never find alive. The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the arrival of a rider from the north, Deputy Chambers returning far sooner than expected. He dismounted quickly, pushing through the crowd toward Hayes with evident urgency. Marshal, he reported breathlessly, Emma Richardson was already en route when I reached Cedar Falls. According to neighbors, she departed yesterday morning with her oldest child. They should arrive by evening. The news landed like a physical blow. Sarah's daughter was already approaching the town where her mother had died, unaware of the chaos awaiting her, unprepared for the truth she'd sought for 15 years. Hayes issued immediate orders. Secure the northern road. I want a detail ready to intercept her before she reaches town limits. She needs to hear this from us, not stumble into the middle of, he gestured at the fractious gathering, whatever this becomes. Judge Peterson seized on the development. Sarah's daughter has built a life without this burden. Would you destroy her peace by forcing her to confront horrors she's managed to live without for 15 years? That's not your decision to make, Georgia countered, Sarah's journal still secure in her possession. Not after lying to her all this time. The gathering began to disperse, common purpose giving way to individual reckonings. Some returned to homes, others drifted toward the Silver Moon, where excavation continued. A few approached Hayes and his deputies voluntarily, offering information or surrendering themselves for questioning. By mid-afternoon, the town had reached an uneasy equilibrium. Federal authority was no longer actively challenged, though neither was it universally accepted. Hayes established his operational headquarters in the town hall, symbolically reclaiming the seat of local government for legitimate authority. Seth and Georgia remained at the Silver Moon, witnessing the methodical recovery of remains. Each set of bones received careful documentation before being placed in individual caskets, simple pine boxes that nonetheless represented more dignity than the victims had been afforded in death. Imagine spending your final days in darkness, knowing no one was coming to save you, Georgia murmured, watching workers emerge from the cave system with another grim discovery. Writing in that journal hoping someone might someday find it and learn the truth. Seth squeezed her hand gently. They didn't die entirely in vain. Their words survived. Because of them, families will finally have answers. Other operations like this one might be discovered and stopped before more lives are lost. A marshal approached with news from Hayes. Emma Richardson and her child had been intercepted on the northern road. Hayes requested Georgia's presence when Emma arrived in town, believing a woman who had read Sarah's journal might provide comfort another official could not. He wants you to bring the journal, the marshal explained. Says she should hear her mother's words directly, not filtered through reports or testimony. The prospect filled Georgia with apprehension. What comfort could she possibly offer to a woman about to learn her entire understanding of her mother had been built on deliberate deception? What words could soften the revelation that her mother hadn't abandoned her, but had died hoping to return? As sunset approached, Georgia waited in the marshal's office, Sarah's journal open before her. She'd spent hours identifying passages Emma should read, moments of courage rather than despair, entries where Sarah spoke of her daughter with fierce love and desperate hope that she would someday understand why her mother had left seeking better opportunities. The sound of horses outside announced their arrival. Georgia composed herself, closing the journal and rising to meet a woman who had spent 15 years searching for a mother who had never stopped trying to return to her. Emma Richardson entered, flanked by Hayes and a deputy, her expression a complex mixture of confusion, apprehension, and the stubborn determination Georgia had come to recognize from Sarah's writing. Beside her walked a girl of perhaps 12, clearly her daughter, with the same set to her jaw and questioning eyes. Mrs. Richardson, Hayes began with uncharacteristic gentleness. This is Georgia Hollister. She and her husband discovered something important regarding your mother, Sarah Mitchell. Emma's eyes fixed on Georgia with immediate intensity. You found her? After all these years? Hope and dread mingled in her voice, the complicated emotions of someone who had built an entire life around an unanswered question. Not exactly, Georgia answered carefully, but we found her words, her final thoughts, and we discovered the truth about what happened to her 15 years ago. Emma sank into a chair, motioning her daughter to remain close. All these years, I've written letters, visited this town annually, asked everyone who might have known her. Always the same answers. She moved on, left no forwarding address, probably remarried somewhere east. I never fully believed it, but I had no alternative explanation. Georgia placed the journal on the desk between them. Your mother didn't abandon you, Emma. She never intended to leave permanently. She came to the Silver Moon seeking work that would support you both, planning to send for you once she was established. Then why didn't she? The simple question contained years of hurt, of birthdays uncelebrated, of milestones unwitnessed. Georgia steeled herself for the hardest truth. Because Jameson Black, the man who owned the Silver Moon, didn't allow his victims to leave. Your mother was imprisoned in a basement beneath the saloon, along with many others who came seeking opportunity and found only cruelty. Emma's face drained of color. Her daughter pressed closer, offering instinctive comfort, though she couldn't fully comprehend the conversation's significance. Imprisoned? Are you saying she was murdered? Yes, Georgia confirmed gently, but she fought until the end. She kept this journal, documented what was happening, tried to create a record that might eventually lead to justice for herself and the others. Her final entries are about you, her hope that you would have the opportunities she never did, her regret at not being able to return to you. Emma stared at the journal, not yet reaching for it, but unable to look away. All these years I thought she didn't want me. Built my entire life trying to be someone worth staying for. She tried to escape, Georgia explained, echoing Silas's words. The map in the basement. She spent weeks planning how to get back to you. Her last entry mentions hiding a locket with your picture in a crack in the wall so she could look at you every day. The revelation broke something in Emma, grief long deferred finally finding expression. She reached for the journal with trembling hands, opening to the first page where Sarah's neat handwriting recorded initial optimism about her new position, her plans to create a better life for her daughter. Hayes withdrew discreetly, signaling Georgia to remain. Emma's daughter watched her mother with solemn understanding beyond her years, somehow recognizing this moment as a fundamental shift in their family's narrative. I want to see where it happened, Emma said finally, closing the journal after reading only the first few pages. I need to see where she spent her final days. Are you certain? Georgia asked gently. The excavation is ongoing. It's difficult to witness. Emma squared her shoulders in a gesture Georgia recognized from Silas's description of Sarah. I've spent 15 years searching for my mother in all the wrong places. I won't turn away from the right one, no matter how painful. Her daughter spoke for the first time, her young voice steady with inherited resilience. We should go together, Mother. Grandmother would want us both to be brave. The simple statement carried profound truth. 3 generations of women connected by blood and determination, only one still living, but all 3 somehow present in this moment of reckoning. As they prepared to depart for the Silver Moon, a commotion outside drew their attention. Hayes burst through the door, his composure momentarily shaken. Judge Peterson has barricaded himself in the courthouse with several armed supporters. They're threatening to destroy records if we attempt to arrest him. The crisis demanded immediate attention, but Hayes hesitated, glancing toward Emma. Mrs. Richardson, I apologize for the timing. Deputy Miller will escort you wherever you wish to go. I must address this situation. Emma rose, her grief temporarily channeled into purpose. I'm coming with you. Judge Peterson was one of the people who lied to my face year after year when I came asking about my mother. I want him to see me when he's finally held accountable. The confrontation at the courthouse unfolded with tense precision. Hayes deployed his men strategically, surrounding the building while maintaining clear lines of communication. Judge Peterson's desperate gambit represented the last gasp of organized resistance, a final attempt to destroy evidence before facing justice. Peterson, Hayes called through the barricaded door, you're only making this worse for yourself and everyone inside. Surrender now and I'll ensure you receive fair treatment. The judge's voice carried from within, strained with desperation. Fair treatment? We both know that's impossible now. 15 years of silence, of building something from the ashes of what Jameson destroyed. All for nothing. The town will die once this becomes public. The town is already transforming, Hayes countered. People are coming forward voluntarily, separating themselves from the conspiracy. This is your chance to do the same. Emma stepped forward, her daughter still close beside her. Judge Peterson, it's Emma Mitchell, Sarah's daughter. I visited your courtroom every year for a decade asking about my mother. Each time you told me you had no information, that she had likely moved on and forgotten her old life. Silence followed, stretching painfully before Peterson responded, his voice noticeably subdued. Emma, I didn't know you were in town. I'm here now, she continued, strength building with each word, and I know the truth, not just about my mother, but about this entire town, about the lies you've told me and countless other families. What I don't understand is why. Why continue the deception for 15 years after Jameson was gone? It wasn't simple cowardice, Peterson answered after a long pause, though that played its part. We told ourselves we were protecting what remained, the innocent children, the people who'd been coerced, the community that might still become something worthwhile despite its foundations. Built on bodies, Emma challenged, built on my mother's bones. The exchange continued, intensely personal, yet addressing fundamental questions of collective guilt and redemption. Whether through Emma's moral authority or simply exhaustion, with 15 years of deception, Peterson's resistance gradually weakened. There's a child here, he called finally. Her mother's name was Catherine Brooks. She disappeared 16 years ago. When Jameson died, her daughter was just 2 years old, being raised by an aunt who never knew what happened. We agreed then that the girl should never learn how her mother died. That wasn't your decision to make, Emma responded firmly. Just as lying to me wasn't your right, no matter how you justified it. The standoff ended not with violence, but with quiet surrender. Judge Peterson and his remaining supporters laid down their weapons and opened the courthouse doors. As marshals led them away, Peterson paused beside Emma, aged beyond his years by the weight of finally confronting his choices. For whatever it's worth, he said quietly, your mother fought harder than any of them. Organized others, tried to expose what was happening. If anyone deserved to be remembered truthfully, it was Sarah. Emma acknowledged his words with a slight nod, neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply recognition of a truth too long concealed. As Peterson was led away, she turned to Georgia. I'm ready to see where she died, to stand where she stood, if only to tell her that I finally know the truth. The silver moon stood silent in the gathering darkness, lanterns illuminating the ongoing work of excavation and documentation. Emma approached slowly, her daughter's hand clasped firmly in hers, Georgia following at a respectful distance. Hayes had arranged for them to view the basement privately, with workers temporarily withdrawn to provide space for this most personal of reckonings. At the entrance to the basement, Emma hesitated, visibly gathering courage before descending the ladder. Georgia waited above, understanding that some journeys must be undertaken alone, or in this case, between mother and daughter, with an invisible third presence guiding them through the darkness and toward a truth 15 years overdue. The soft murmur of voices drifted up from below, Emma reading passages from Sarah's journal aloud to her daughter, connecting 3 generations through words preserved against all odds. The quiet intimacy of their communion with the dead stood in stark contrast to the town's tumultuous reckoning happening beyond the silver moon's charred walls. In that moment, watching a family reclaim its true history despite all efforts to bury it, Georgia understood the most profound truth of their discovery. No secret remains hidden forever. No lie endures indefinitely. And even 15 years of collective silence cannot withstand the human need for truth, however painful its revelation might be. Word count, 6,965. Dawn broke over the hills surrounding the town, bathing the landscape in a pale gold light that belied the darkness still lingering beneath the surface. 3 days had passed since Judge Peterson's surrender, transforming what had begun as Seth and George's terrifying discovery into a federal investigation of unprecedented scope. Additional marshals had arrived from the territorial capital, bringing the force to over 30 men, enough to secure evidence, process prisoners, and maintain order in a community now fractured by exposed truths. Seth stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as workers carefully removed another set of remains from the cave system. The methodical recovery had continued day and night, with 27 distinct burial sites now documented. Each discovery represented not just a victim, but a family somewhere still waiting for answers. Parents who had spent years wondering if their child might someday return, siblings who had grown up with an empty chair at the table, children who had constructed entire identities around abandonment rather than murder. Hayes approached, his features drawn from too little sleep and too many difficult decisions. We've identified 63 victims so far, matching personal effects to official missing persons reports, cross-referencing with town records Mrs. Winters provided. Each identification triggers a notification process. Marshals dispatched to inform families, provide what closure we can. The administrative machinery of justice struck Seth as simultaneously essential and inadequate. How could paperwork and proper procedure possibly address the magnitude of suffering represented by each pine box now lined up in the improvised morgue behind the church? Hayes seemed to read his thoughts. It feels insufficient, I know, clinical, when what happened here was anything but. Yet documenting each victim properly ensures their deaths aren't merely tragic, but legally established crimes. Evidence rather than anecdote. Georgia joined them, her clothing dusty from hours spent in the records office, where she'd been helping catalog documents seized from the courthouse. The work suited her methodical mind, her teacher's attention to detail finding purpose in organizing evidence that would eventually secure convictions. We found something important, she announced, producing a leather-bound ledger, Jameson Black's financial records, dating back to his arrival 20 years ago. It documents bribes to officials across 3 territories, blackmail payments, even his selection process for the Silver Moon's location. Hayes accepted the ledger, immediately recognizing its significance. This connects everything, local corruption to territorial officials, specific victims to specific dates. The conspiracy extended beyond this town, potentially implicating judges, legislators, even a territorial governor. The implications expanded the case beyond even Hayes's expectations. What had appeared to be a horrific but isolated crime now revealed itself as something far more extensive. A network of corruption and exploitation stretching across state lines, involving officials at multiple levels of government. How high does this go? Seth wondered aloud, the scope of the conspiracy seeming to grow with each new discovery. High enough that I've requested federal prosecutors from Washington, Hayes replied grimly. This case is beyond territorial jurisdiction now. The names in this ledger, if verified, will shake the foundation of governance throughout the region. The conversation halted as Emma Richardson approached, her daughter beside her. 3 days of confronting brutal truths had etched new lines in her face, yet paradoxically granted her a resolute strength. Each morning she had returned to the Silver Moon, reading more of her mother's journal, sometimes aloud to her daughter, creating connection across 3 generations through words preserved against all odds. Marshall Hayes, she acknowledged with quiet dignity, I've made a decision about my mother's remains. Once identification is complete, I'd like to take her home to Cedar Falls. She should rest near family, not in the ground that concealed her murder for 15 years. Hayes nodded respectfully. Of course, we'll provide transportation, proper documentation, whatever assistance you require. He hesitated before adding, the prosecutors will eventually need Sarah's journal as evidence, but I'll ensure it's returned to you afterward. It belongs in your family's keeping. Emma's expression softened slightly. I've been thinking about that. The journal contains accounts from multiple victims, not just my mother. Their families deserve to hear their final words too. Her fingers traced the journal's worn binding. I'd like to create copies, faithful transcriptions for each family so every victim's voice can return home. The suggestion embodied the transformation occurring not just in Emma, but throughout the community. From concealment toward acknowledgement, from private grief to shared reckoning. Georgia immediately offered her assistance with the transcription project, recognizing both its practical value as healing ritual and its evidentiary importance. As they discussed logistics, a rider approached at speed from the direction of the territorial capital. The messenger's urgent demeanor suggested news of significance. Hayes excused himself to receive the communication, his expression growing increasingly somber as he read the dispatch. There's been a development, he announced upon returning. Federal prosecutors arrived in Carsonville yesterday to begin proceedings against officials implicated in Black's ledger. This morning, Territorial Judge Wilson was found dead in his chambers, apparent suicide, though circumstances suggest otherwise. The news landed heavily. Wilson's name had appeared repeatedly in the ledger, receiving substantial payments, coinciding with dismissed investigations into missing persons throughout the territory. They're cleaning house, Seth realized, eliminating witnesses who might implicate others higher up. Hayes nodded grimly. I've ordered immediate security measures for all prisoners and key witnesses. No one enters or leaves custody without my direct authorization. Mrs. Winters and others who've provided evidence will receive round-the-clock protection. The revelations transformed their understanding of the danger still surrounding them. This wasn't merely the exposure of past crimes, but an ongoing conspiracy with resources and reach beyond their immediate control. The Silver Moon's shadow stretched farther than anyone had imagined. Emma absorbed these developments with remarkable composure. My mother wrote about this, her suspicion that Jameson Black wasn't acting alone, that his operation had protection beyond the town. She documented conversations she overheard between Black and visitors who arrived in expensive carriages, spoke with educated accents. Hayes's interest sharpened immediately. Is this documented in the journal? Names, dates, any identifying details? Some entries describe visitors by appearance or mannerism, Emma confirmed. My mother was observant, recorded details others might overlook. I noticed connections while reading, but didn't recognize their significance until now. This new avenue of investigation demanded immediate attention. Hayes arranged for Emma to work with a deputy specialized in witness testimony, reviewing Sarah's journal for any information that might identify Black's powerful associates or clients. While this work proceeded, Seth and Georgia found themselves in an unexpected role. De facto liaisons between federal authorities and townsfolk, not directly implicated in the conspiracy. Their status as outsiders who had exposed the truth yet had no prior connection to the crimes granted them unique credibility with both sides. Georgia utilized this position to organize a community meeting at the church, creating space for residents to process collective trauma without fear of immediate legal consequences. Hayes approved the gathering with certain parameters: no discussion of specific evidence, no coaching of potential witnesses, federal observers present but unobtrusive. The church filled beyond capacity that evening. Families with children seated in front pews, elderly residents along walls, younger adults standing in back, a cross-section of the community's remaining population. Georgia stood before them, her school teacher's presence naturally commanding attention without demanding it. "We gather not to assign blame or proclaim innocence," she began, "but to acknowledge a shared reality that has shaped this community for 15 years. Some of you participated actively in concealing what happened at the Silver Moon. Others suspected but remained silent. Many genuinely knew nothing, but now find yourselves bearing consequences nonetheless." The atmosphere shifted palpably as collective denial gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. Faces that had maintained careful neutrality for days now revealed complex emotions: grief, guilt, anger, even tentative relief. "This community faces a choice," Georgia continued. "You can cling to secrets that are already exposed, defend actions already documented, and sacrifice your future to protect a past that cannot be changed. Or you can begin the difficult work of honest accounting with authorities, with victims' families, but perhaps most importantly, with yourselves and your children." A woman rose from a middle pew, her voice trembling but determined. "My husband was the town clerk when Jameson Black arrived. He processed permits for the Silver Moon's construction, later falsified records to hide disappearances. He drank himself to death 6 years ago, never speaking of what he'd done, but I found his private journal after he passed, full of self-loathing, detailed accounts of his complicity." Her public confession opened floodgates within the gathering. Others stood to share fragments of knowledge, expressions of regret, moments when they'd chosen safety over intervention. The testimonies ranged from peripheral involvement to active participation, creating a tapestry of community culpability that defied simple categorization. Seth observed from the side, noting Hayes's deputies discreetly documenting these voluntary statements. The marshal had been strategic in permitting this gathering, creating space for community catharsis while gathering additional evidence and identifying new witnesses. A teenage boy rose hesitantly, his youth making him clearly innocent of direct involvement in events 15 years earlier. "My father's in custody now. Yesterday, Marshal Hayes showed me ledgers proving he received payments from Jameson Black." His voice cracked with emotion. "Everything we have, our house, the store, my education fund, came from that money. What happens to us now? Do we lose everything because of what he did?" The question crystallized concerns shared by many present. The practical consequences for families whose lives had been built, knowingly or not, on foundations of blood money. No simple answer existed, no clean separation between justice for victims and protection of innocent dependents. Georgia addressed the complexity directly. There are no easy answers to these questions. The legal system will determine consequences for those directly involved, but this community must also determine how to move forward collectively, how to support children who bear no guilt for their parents' actions, how to honor victims while rebuilding something worthwhile from what remains. The gathering continued for hours, evolving from confession toward tentative problem-solving. Proposals emerged organically, establishing a victim compensation fund, creating educational resources about the tragedy, developing community service requirements for those peripherally involved but not criminally charged. As the meeting concluded, An elderly woman who had remained silent throughout approached Georgia privately. I was the midwife here for 40 years, delivered most of these folks standing before you now. What happened at the Silver Moon? It wasn't the beginning of our troubles, just the worst manifestation. Georgia listened as the woman described a community that had compromised its values incrementally, accepting small corruptions years before Jameson Black arrived. The Silver Moon represented not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of ethical boundaries already weakened through accommodation and rationalization. Healing won't come through courts alone, the midwife concluded, though justice must play its part. True recovery requires examining how we became vulnerable to such darkness in the first place. Her insight resonated deeply with Georgia's observations. The Silver Moon's horror hadn't emerged from nowhere but from fertile ground already prepared through collective moral compromise. Addressing the specific crimes would bring necessary justice, but preventing recurrence required deeper cultural transformation. Dawn brought news that reinforcements had arrived from Washington. 3 federal prosecutors, accompanied by additional marshals and investigators specializing in government corruption. The territorial capital had dispatched representatives as well, though their motives remained suspect given evidence suggesting their own complicity. Hayes gathered Seth, Georgia, and Emma for a briefing in the marshal's temporary headquarters. The expanded federal presence marked a significant escalation, moving beyond local investigation towards systematic prosecution. The case has been classified as a matter of national significance, Hayes explained. Prosecutors will pursue charges across 3 categories: direct participation in murders, administrative facilitation of the operation, and obstruction of justice through the 15-year cover-up. The lead prosecutor, James Harrington, cut an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the precise diction of an Eastern education and unwavering ethical conviction. This case presents unprecedented challenges, he acknowledged. The extensive time span, the community-wide conspiracy of silence, the apparent reach into territorial governance, each element alone would make prosecution difficult. Combined, they require innovative legal approaches. Seth voiced the concern that had troubled him throughout the investigation. How do you determine different levels of guilt? The person who killed directly seems obviously culpable, but what about the clerk who processed false paperwork, or the neighbor who suspected but remained silent? Harrington nodded, appreciating the moral complexity. Criminal law recognizes gradations of culpability: direct perpetrators, accessories before and after the fact, conspirators with varying levels of involvement. Our challenge isn't just securing convictions, but ensuring proportionality, punishment that reflects actual moral responsibility rather than expedient scapegoating. Emma's perspective provided essential balance to the legal discussion. As someone who lost their mother here, I need justice. But justice doesn't necessarily mean identical punishment for everyone involved. Some acted from malice, others from fear or coercion. The truth matters more to me than universal retribution. Her capacity for nuance despite personal loss impressed the federal officials. Harrington requested her continued involvement as the prosecution developed its approach, recognizing that victims' perspectives should inform justice rather than simply being served by it. As the meeting concluded, Hayes pulled Seth and Georgia aside. We've recovered something significant from the cave system, a lockbox containing letters never sent. Victims' final communications to family members, apparently collected by Jameson Black as some kind of trophy. The discovery represented both evidence and sacred trust. Each letter contained potential testimony against perpetrators, yet also constituted profoundly personal communication never intended for legal proceedings. The ethical considerations extended beyond typical evidentiary concerns. We'd like your assistance in cataloging these materials, Hayes continued. Your connection with Emma and your original discovery of the basement grants you unique perspective. You've demonstrated the necessary balance between investigative rigor and human compassion. The responsibility weighed heavily as Seth and Georgia began reviewing the recovered correspondence later that morning. Each envelope represented a life interrupted, final thoughts never shared with loved ones. Many contained information crucial to the investigation: specific accusations, descriptions of perpetrators, details of the operation's methodology. One letter particularly affected Georgia. written by a young woman named Catherine to her infant daughter. The elegant handwriting described hopes for her child's future, explanations for her absence, and a mother's enduring love despite circumstances beyond her control. Catherine's daughter, now 17, had been raised by an aunt who never knew what happened to her sister. Judge Peterson mentioned her, Georgia recalled, the child he claimed they were protecting by maintaining the cover-up. She carefully set the letter aside. She deserves to know her mother thought of her until the end, just as Emma deserved to know about Sarah. By midday, excavation teams had recovered additional remains, bringing the total to 83 individuals positively identified. Each identification triggered the notification process. Marshals dispatched to communities across 3 territories, bearing news that would simultaneously shatter illusions and provide long-sought answers. Seth assisted with the documentation, ensuring each victim's belongings were properly cataloged and preserved both as evidence and eventual keepsakes for families. The systematic approach couldn't diminish the emotional weight of the work, but provided necessary structure for processing tragedy of such magnitude. Emma continued her collaboration with investigators, identifying specific entries in Sarah's journal that corroborated financial records from Black's ledger. Her mother's observations about visitors to the Silver Moon helped establish connections between local operations and territorial officials, strengthening the prosecution's ability to pursue higher-level conspirators. The arrival of the first victims' families that afternoon transformed the investigation's atmosphere. What had been primarily a legal and procedural exercise became viscerally human as parents, siblings, and children confronted the physical reality of their loved one's fate. Some collapsed in grief upon seeing personal effects preserved in the basement. Others maintained stoic composure while identifying remains. All carried the weight of answers that, while providing closure, shattered any lingering hope of reunion. A middle-aged couple approached Seth as he supervised the cataloging of recovered items. The woman held a photograph of a smiling young man in his early 20s. "Our son, Thomas. He left for a job opportunity here 18 years ago. Last letter mentioned employment at a new establishment called the Silver Moon." Seth compared the photograph to documentation of recovered remains and personal effects. After confirming the match through dental records and clothing description, he faced the hardest part of his unexpected role, confirming death while providing what dignity remained possible. "We've recovered your son's remains, along with several personal items." He retrieved a carefully preserved pocket watch and letter from secured storage. "This was found among his possessions. It appears to be a letter he was writing to you before." The father accepted the items with trembling hands, opening the unfinished letter addressed to mother and father. Thomas had been writing home about his plans to save money for agricultural college. His hope to return with education that would improve the family farm. The letter ended mid-sentence, the interruption itself evidence of sudden catastrophe. Did he suffer? The question every family asked, none truly wanting the complete answer. Seth balanced truth with mercy. The evidence suggests Thomas fought bravely. His remains were found near a makeshift weapon. He didn't surrender to whatever happened here. The explanation offered small comfort. Their son had maintained courage even in circumstances beyond endurance. The mother clutched the pocket watch they'd given him for his 18th birthday, now returned after nearly 2 decades. "We'd like to take him home," the father stated simply. "Bury him properly on family land, where he belongs." Seth assured them arrangements would be made once the necessary documentation was complete. As they departed to complete paperwork with federal officials, Georgia joined him, having observed the interaction from nearby. How many more families will come seeking answers? Her question acknowledged the magnitude of grief still unfolding around them. And how many will never know what happened to their loved ones because remains couldn't be identified? The reality of incomplete resolution hung heavily over the investigation. Despite meticulous recovery efforts, some victims would remain unidentified. Some families would continue searching without answers. The imperfection of justice, even when pursued with absolute commitment, remained an inescapable reality. Evening brought unexpected complication as territorial officials arrived, ostensibly to support the federal investigation, but clearly pursuing their own agenda. Their spokesman, Administrative Judge Lawrence Caldwell, projected authoritative concern, while subtly attempting to assert jurisdiction over aspects of the case. The territorial government recognizes the heinous nature of these crimes and fully supports federal prosecution of those directly responsible, Caldwell announced during a meeting with Hayes and the federal prosecutors. However, matters involving territorial officials fall under our internal review procedures. We request all documentation pertaining to such officials be transferred to our custody immediately. Hayes and Harrington exchanged knowing glances. Caldwell's name had appeared multiple times in Black's ledger, receiving substantial payments coinciding with redirected investigations away from the Silver Moon's activities. With respect, Judge Caldwell, Harrington responded carefully, federal authority supersedes territorial jurisdiction in cases involving interstate criminal conspiracy. All evidence remains in federal custody during active investigation. The territorial delegation's presence added dangerous complexity to an already volatile situation. Hayes doubled security around evidence storage and key witnesses, particularly Mrs. Winters, and others who had provided documentation implicating territorial officials. Seth and Georgia found themselves under additional protection as well, their status as original discoverers making them both essential witnesses and potential targets. Hayes assigned deputies to remain with them at all times, a precaution that underscored ongoing danger despite apparent progress toward justice. The most dangerous period in any conspiracy investigation comes when powerful figures realize they can't contain exposure, Hayes explained privately. We've moved beyond the local cover-up to something with much further reach. The people implicated now have resources, influence, potentially even legal authority in portions of the territory. The warning proved prescient when, shortly before midnight, a guard intercepted an attempt to access the evidence room where Black's ledger and other key documents were secured. The perpetrator, a clerk accompanying the territorial delegation, carried instructions to remove specific pages from the financial records. Hayes ordered immediate detention of the entire territorial delegation pending investigation of their involvement. The action represented significant escalation, directly challenging territorial authority and potentially creating jurisdictional conflict that could undermine the entire case. Harrington supported Hayes's decision, but recognized its implications. We've crossed a threshold, he acknowledged during an emergency meeting with the investigation's key personnel. By detaining territorial officials, we've explicitly established federal preeminence in this matter. Washington will need to formally endorse this position, or we risk creating legal vulnerability that defense attorneys will exploit. The meeting concluded with dispatch riders sent toward Washington carrying urgent requests for explicit Justice Department authorization. Until such reinforcement arrived, they would proceed under Hayes's authority as federal marshal, maintaining custody of all evidence and witnesses regardless of territorial objections. Dawn brought news from Cedar Falls. Emma's children and husband had arrived safely under marshal escort, reuniting the family under federal protection. Their presence provided emotional support for Emma, while ensuring her family couldn't be used as leverage against her continuing cooperation. Emma's husband, Michael Richardson, brought valuable perspective as a respected educator uninvolved in the tragedy, yet deeply connected to its aftermath. His first concern centered naturally on his wife's well-being as she confronted traumatic revelations, but he quickly grasped the broader significance of the investigation. Emma has spent her entire adult life searching for her mother, he explained to Georgia during a quiet moment. That search shaped everything. Her decision to become a teacher, her work with orphan children, even her determination that our children would always know their complete family history, however imperfect. The observation illuminated how tragedy had rippled through generations, shaping identities and life choices in ways both visible and subtle. Emma's work educating orphans represented an unconscious connection with her own experience of perceived abandonment. Her insistence on family transparency reflected determination that her children would never experience the uncertainty that had defined her own childhood. Now that she knows the truth, Michael continued, she's already transforming that knowledge into purpose. Last night, she began outlining a foundation to help families locate missing loved ones. She wants Sarah's story to create something constructive from unimaginable loss. The capacity for regeneration amid devastation struck Georgia as the investigation's most profound revelation. Alongside documented horror emerged countless examples of resilience, victims who maintained dignity in impossible circumstances, families who never abandoned their search for truth, community members who eventually found courage to break 15 years of silence. This complexity informed the approach developing under Harrington's guidance. Rather than pursuing uniform prosecution of everyone connected to the conspiracy, federal authorities established tiered categories of culpability. Those directly involved in murders faced capital charges. Administrative facilitators would be charged according to their level of knowledge and benefit. Those who participated in the cover-up but not the original crimes faced obstruction of justice charges, with consideration given to coercion and subsequent cooperation. Justice that destroys innocent lives isn't justice at all, Harrington explained as the framework took shape. Children shouldn't lose homes because their parents committed crimes. Businesses essential to community survival shouldn't collapse because their owners failed moral obligations. We're developing structures for restitution that punish perpetrators while preserving whatever community remains. The practical implementation of these principles emerged through creation of a victim compensation fund. Property and assets directly connected to Black's operation would be liquidated, with proceeds distributed to victims' families. Businesses built with tainted money, but now serving legitimate community needs would continue operating under receivership, with portions of profit dedicated to restitution. As these legal mechanisms developed, the human dimension of recovery continued unfolding through Emma's initiative. She had established temporary headquarters in the church, creating a center where families arriving to claim loved ones could find both practical assistance and emotional support. When I came searching for my mother all those years, I faced wall after wall of silence, she explained to newly arrived families. No one should confront this kind of tragedy alone, especially after years of uncertainty. The gathering of families created unexpected community. People connected through similar loss, finding solace in shared experience. Parents who had searched for missing children for decades discovered others who understood their specific grief. Siblings who had grown up with conspicuous absence found validation from those with parallel experiences. This emergent support network extended beyond emotional comfort to practical collaboration. Families combined resources to arrange transportation of remains, shared information about legal proceedings, even coordinated memorial services. What began as individual tragedy transformed gradually into collective healing, not diminishing personal grief, but creating context that rendered it more bearable. Seth observed this evolution with profound respect. They're creating something remarkable from unimaginable circumstances, he noted to Georgia as they watched families gathered in the church. Not just supporting one another through grief, but actively building connections that might endure beyond this immediate crisis. Georgia recognized the pattern from her teaching experience. The most resilient communities I've encountered share this quality, the ability to transform shared suffering into constructive action. It doesn't eliminate pain, but creates meaning alongside it. Their conversation was interrupted by Hayes's urgent approach. We've received confirmation from Washington. The Attorney General has formally designated this a federal matter, superseding territorial jurisdiction. Additional prosecutors arrive tomorrow, along with military escort to secure transportation of prisoners to the Capitol for trial. The development represented significant validation of their work, while heightening security concerns during the vulnerable transition period. Hayes immediately implemented comprehensive protection protocols for witnesses, evidence, and the growing number of families now present in town. By afternoon, the excavation team had recovered what appeared to be the final remains from the cave system, bringing the total to 112 individuals. While fewer than the 118 marks counted in the basement tally, the discrepancy could be explained by incomplete recovery due to deterioration or displacement. The formal identification process continued, with 89 victims now positively identified through physical evidence, dental records, and personal effects. Each identification initiated notification procedures, bringing more families into the growing community of mourners seeking closure and justice. Among these arrivals came a striking young woman accompanied by an elderly aunt, Catherine Brooks's daughter, now 17, and bearing remarkable resemblance to the mother she'd never known. Georgia immediately recognized the connection to the letter she'd cataloged days earlier, Catherine's final communication to her infant child. The young woman, Elizabeth, approached the evidence collection center with quiet determination. "I'm told you found something my mother wrote to me before she died." Georgia retrieved the carefully preserved letter, explaining its discovery and context. "We found this among personal effects recovered from the cave system. Based on dating and other evidence, we believe your mother wrote this during her final days at the Silver Moon." Elizabeth accepted the letter with remarkable composure. Unlike many family members who broke down immediately upon receiving such evidence, she maintained controlled dignity while requesting privacy to read her mother's final words. When she emerged later, her composure remained intact, though her eyes reflected profound emotional processing. "My entire life, I was told my mother abandoned me as an infant. My aunt tried to compensate with stories about her, but the narrative of abandonment shaped everything. How I viewed myself, my worth, my capacity to be loved. The letter had fundamentally altered this foundation. She didn't leave by choice. She never stopped thinking of me. Her final act was writing this letter, making sure I would someday know the truth." Elizabeth's voice remained steady through evident emotion. "That changes everything, not just about her, but about who I am and who I might become." The transformation occurring within Elizabeth mirrored Emma's experience. Profound reconfiguration of identity through revelation of truth long concealed. What had been constructed as personal rejection revealed itself as tragedy beyond control, shifting the narrative from abandonment to interrupted love. This pattern repeated across dozens of families as the investigation continued. Children who had built identities around perceived abandonment discovered parents who had died still thinking of them. Parents who had imagined children establishing lives elsewhere without communication confronted the finality of loss, but also the certainty that their children had not chosen separation. By evening, the first funerals began, simple ceremonies conducted with whatever dignity could be salvaged from circumstances beyond conventional comprehension. Emma led efforts to provide appropriate resources, working with local craftsmen to produce suitable caskets, arranging transportation for families returning home with recovered remains. Seth assisted with practical arrangements while Georgia continued documentation work essential to both legal proceedings and historical record. Together, they witnessed the first stages of a healing process that would continue long after federal authorities concluded their immediate work. The arrival of additional federal prosecutors the following morning brought both reinforcement and complication. While their presence further legitimized the investigation, their approach reflected Washington priorities that sometimes diverged from the community-centered framework Hayes and Harrington had established. Lead prosecutor Thomas Whitfield emphasized expedient prosecution over nuanced justice. "Our primary mandate is securing convictions against principal perpetrators and corrupt officials," he explained during the transition briefing. While community healing matters, the Justice Department's foremost concern remains establishing federal authority in territorial criminal matters. The shift in emphasis created immediate tension. Whitfield questioned arrangements for victim compensation, challenged protective measures for peripheral participants who had provided cooperative testimony, and expressed skepticism about graduated prosecution based on levels of culpability. These distinctions may satisfy philosophical notions of proportional justice, he argued, but they complicate prosecution and potentially undermine our ability to secure convictions against principal offenders. Hayes defended the approach developed through weeks of direct engagement with the community and victims' families. "This isn't abstract philosophy, but practical reality. If we pursue scorched earth prosecution that destroys innocent dependents alongside guilty parties, we perpetuate cycles of victimization rather than establishing justice." The principal disagreement remained unresolved as preparation began for transporting key prisoners to Washington for trial. 28 individuals, including Mayor Collins, Judge Peterson, and several territorial officials implicated through Black's Ledger, would face federal prosecution for crimes ranging from murder to obstruction of justice to corruption of government function. Another 63 individuals would face territorial charges under federal supervision, ensuring accountability while maintaining proportionality between actions and consequences. The remaining townspeople, those peripherally aware but not actively complicit, would participate in the community restitution program developed through Harrington's framework. As transport preparations proceeded, Seth and Georgia faced unexpected personal decision. Their original purpose, purchasing and renovating the Silver Moon, had been utterly transformed by subsequent events. The property now represented both crime scene and eventual memorial site, its future determined by considerations beyond private ownership. Hayes approached them with formal proposition. The federal government wishes to acquire the Silver Moon property for establishment of an appropriate memorial. You would receive full compensation for your investment, plus consideration for your essential role in exposing these crimes. The offer provided practical resolution to their immediate circumstances while raising profound questions about their future. The life they'd imagined building in this community no longer existed as possibility, yet their connection to the people and events here had created responsibilities not easily abandoned. "We need time to consider," Georgia requested, recognizing the decision's complexity. "Our original purpose has obviously changed, but our commitment to seeing this through remains." While they contemplated their options, Emma approached with alternative proposal. "Michael and I have been discussing the foundation I'm establishing for families of missing persons. We'd like to headquarter it here, at least initially, to work directly with families still arriving to claim loved ones." Her vision extended beyond immediate crisis management toward lasting institutional change. What happened here represents systematic failure across multiple levels: law enforcement, judicial oversight, community responsibility. Creating mechanisms to prevent recurrence requires sustained commitment beyond the immediate legal proceedings. The proposal offered meaningful purpose amid circumstances neither Seth nor Georgia could have anticipated when purchasing the Silver Moon. Rather than simply selling the property and departing, they could contribute to transformation out of tragedy into constructive change. "We'd need to discuss specifics," Seth responded, genuinely intrigued by the possibility. "But the concept aligns with our feelings about responsibility extending beyond the immediate investigation." This conversation, like many during this period, occurred against backdrop of continuing arrivals. Families journeying from across 3 territories to identify remains, collect personal effects, and participate in the emerging community of shared grief and recovery. Among these arrivals came an elderly couple whose presence created immediate impact. Marcus and Elena Mitchell, Sarah's brother and his wife, had spent 15 years searching for both Sarah and her daughter Emma, unaware that Emma had established a life just 2 territories away. The reunion between Emma and her uncle unfolded with profound emotion. Marcus had been the catalyst for the Silver Moon's destruction, his persistent questioning about Sarah's disappearance eventually prompting town members to take action against Jameson Black. Though the fire had ended Black's operation, the subsequent cover-up had prevented Marcus from discovering either his sister's fate or his niece's whereabouts. "I never stopped searching," Marcus explained, embracing Emma with tears flowing freely, "followed every rumor, investigated every lead. Authorities dismissed me as obsessed, delusional, even hired private investigators when I could afford it." The connection represented healing across generations, Emma simultaneously discovering her mother's fate and reclaiming extended families she hadn't known existed. Marcus and Elena brought photographs of Sarah's childhood, stories unknown to Emma, establishing continuity between past and present that 15 years of deception had severed. Their arrival coincided with the preparations for a memorial service honoring all identified victims. The ceremony would precede transportation of remains to respective family homes, creating opportunity for collective acknowledgement before individual mourning processes continued in private. Emma and Georgia collaborated on arrangements, creating framework that balanced communal experience with respect for diverse religious and cultural traditions represented among victims' families. The Silver Moon site itself, now cleared of excavation equipment, would serve as gathering place, transforming space associated with death into site of remembrance and potential healing. As dawn broke on the day of the memorial service, Seth stood at the Silver Moon's perimeter, watching early light illuminate the valley surrounding the town. The physical transformation was striking. The charred ruin that had greeted them upon arrival, now replaced by cleared ground, awaiting whatever would be built upon it. Hayes joined him, the marshal's usual intensity tempered by rare reflectiveness. "In 15 years with the service, I've never witnessed anything approaching this scale, not just in number of victims, but in duration of concealment and extent of conspiracy." Seth nodded, understanding the veteran lawman's need to process extraordinary circumstances. How does one make sense of such systematic failure? Not just individual criminals, but entire systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. Hayes considered the question with appropriate gravity. Justice delayed isn't the same as justice denied, though that offers cold comfort to families who searched for 15 years without answers. What matters now is ensuring this particular failure never repeats, that systems strengthen rather than collapse when tested by similar circumstances. Their conversation paused as Georgia approached, accompanied by Emma and her family. Together, they surveyed the prepared memorial site, where 112 simple wooden markers had been placed representing each recovered victim. Families had begun gathering already, some placing flowers or personal mementos beside markers bearing loved ones' names. The ceremony itself unfolded with dignity, transcending its improvised nature. Hayes spoke briefly about the investigation and ongoing pursuit of justice. Harrington outlined legal proceedings that would follow. Religious leaders from various traditions offered prayers and reflections appropriate to the solemn occasion. Most powerful were statements from family members themselves, parents recalling children who had departed full of hope for new opportunities, siblings describing decades of uncertainty now replaced by painful certainty, children expressing complex emotions about parents they'd believed had abandoned them voluntarily. Emma's address provided framework for collective grief while acknowledging individual experiences. Each person honored here today represents a unique life, a specific set of dreams interrupted, a particular constellation of relationships disrupted. We gather to acknowledge both shared loss and distinctive grief, recognizing that justice, however comprehensive, cannot restore what was taken. Her words created space for authentic mourning without false promises of complete resolution. What we can offer one another is witness, the commitment to remember not just how these lives ended, but how they were lived. And beyond remembrance, we can create meaning through transforming tragedy into action that prevents similar suffering in the future. The foundation she proposed would establish practical mechanisms supporting this commitment, resources for families searching for missing loved ones, advocacy for improved investigation protocols, education addressing community responsibility for recognizing and reporting suspicious circumstances. As the ceremony concluded, families began the process of claiming remains for transport to respective home communities. Each departure represented continuation of individual healing journeys that would extend far beyond this shared moment of acknowledgement. Seth and Georgia found themselves at critical juncture regarding their own path forward. Their decision crystallized through conversation with Emma and Michael, Hayes and Harrington, and ultimately between themselves. Balancing practical considerations against moral responsibility emerging from their unexpected involvement in these events. We came seeking new beginning after losing everything to drought, Seth reflected as they finalized their decision. Found something entirely different from what we anticipated, yet perhaps aligned with deeper purpose we hadn't recognized in ourselves. Georgia nodded, her teacher's instinct for meaningful contribution, finding unexpected application in these extraordinary circumstances. Some responsibilities choose us rather than being chosen. Having discovered what happened here, we can't simply walk away once immediate legal proceedings conclude. Their decision solidified. They would remain temporarily, supporting establishment of Emma's foundation while participating in ongoing legal proceedings as needed. The Silver Moon property would transfer to foundation ownership through arrangement with federal authorities, transforming site of tragedy into headquarters for prevention and healing. Not permanent relocation, Georgia clarified in discussion with Emma, but commitment extending through initial establishment phase, perhaps a year or more depending on developments. The arrangement provided framework for meaningful contribution while acknowledging that their long-term future likely lay elsewhere. Property settlement from federal authorities would eventually fund whatever next chapter they determined appropriate, but immediate departure would have constituted abdication of responsibility they now recognized as theirs. As prisoner transport preparations concluded, Hayes provided final briefing regarding ongoing security measures. 28 individuals would depart for Washington under military escort, including Mayor Collins, Judge Peterson, and territorial officials implicated through documentation. Federal prosecutors would present evidence before a grand jury, initiating formal proceedings that would likely continue for months. Your testimony will eventually be required in Washington, Hayes explained. But immediate presence isn't necessary given extensive documentation already secured. You'll receive formal notification when grand jury requires your appearance. The investigation's focus had expanded beyond the Silver Moon itself to the broader conspiracy protecting and facilitating its operation. Black's ledger had revealed connections to officials across 3 territories, suggesting systematic corruption rather than isolated criminal enterprise. What began as local tragedy has revealed rot extending throughout territorial governance, Harrington observed during final consultation before departing with prisoners. The Silver Moon represents most visible manifestation of corruption that likely enabled similar operations elsewhere. Each revelation potentially leads to additional investigations across the region. This expanding scope reinforced the importance of Emma's foundation and Seth and George's decision to support its establishment. Beyond addressing specific tragedy that had occurred here, their work would potentially prevent similar operations from developing elsewhere through improved reporting mechanisms and community education. 1 week after the memorial service, the town had transformed significantly. Many residents had departed permanently, unwilling to remain in community now defined by exposed tragedy. Others committed to rebuilding, particularly those with no direct involvement in the conspiracy who nevertheless felt responsibility for contributing to recovery. The church had become headquarters for Emma's foundation, with Georgia providing organizational expertise and Seth contributing practical skills toward physical infrastructure. Their experience discovering and documenting the Silver Moon's secrets proved invaluable in developing protocols for investigating similar disappearances elsewhere. Among Foundation's first initiatives was systematic review of unsolved missing persons cases throughout the territory, searching for patterns potentially indicating similar operations. This work represented direct extension of Sarah's efforts documented in her journal, identifying connections between seemingly isolated disappearances to reveal systematic criminal activity. The Silver Moon site itself remained temporarily undeveloped, accessible only to families of identified victims who continued arriving to pay respects before memorials were permanently established. Plans for eventual monument had begun taking shape through consultation with victims' families, ensuring design would appropriately honor those lost while educating future generations about dangers of collective silence. 1 month after discovery of the trapdoor that had initiated these events, Seth stood again at the Silver Moon's perimeter, surveying physical space that had acquired such profound significance. The basement had been permanently sealed following evidence collection, cave system entrances secured against unauthorized access, ground prepared for whatever memorial would eventually rise from this foundation. Georgia joined him, documents in hand, representing initial charter for Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Missing Persons. Emma had insisted on naming the organization after her mother, ensuring Sarah's experience would continue generating positive change despite its tragic conclusion. Not what we expected when we arrived, Seth observed, understatement masking complex emotions regarding their transformed circumstances. Hard to believe just 4 weeks have passed since we first stood here. Georgia nodded, reviewing documentation that formalized their commitment to remaining through Foundation's establishment phase. Some journeys can't be measured in conventional time. What we've experienced here, what everyone involved has experienced, represents something beyond ordinary chronology. Their conversation paused as Emma approached, accompanied by her daughter. 3 generations connected through tragedy, yet now creating purpose from circumstances that might otherwise have produced only bitterness. The youngest, Mitchell Richardson, carried wildflowers gathered from surrounding hills, placing them carefully at base of temporary marker bearing her grandmother's name. "She would have liked you," Emma told Georgia, watching her daughter's simple tribute. "My mother valued people who faced truth directly, no matter how difficult." Sarah's journal shows someone who documented reality even when that reality was unbearable. The observation captured essential quality that had ultimately exposed the Silver Moon's secrets: courage to acknowledge truth rather than accept comfortable deception. From Sarah's documentation of her imprisonment to Seth and George's refusal to ignore what they discovered to Silas's eventual decision to contact authorities, at each juncture, individuals had chosen difficult truth over expedient silence. The Foundation's first quarterly report goes to the Justice Department next week, Emma continued, shifting toward practical matters. We've already identified 3 cases showing patterns similar to what happened here. Young people disappearing while seeking employment opportunities, authorities dismissing concerns from searching families. This tangible progress reinforced their decision to remain through initial establishment phase. The Foundation's work had already expanded beyond commemorating past tragedy toward preventing future recurrence. Exactly the transformation Sarah had sought in her final journal entries. As afternoon light lengthened shadows across the silver moon's footprint, Seth recognized profound truth about justice in imperfect world. Complete restoration remained impossible. Lives taken couldn't be returned. Years of searching couldn't be undone. Grief experienced couldn't be erased. Yet meaningful change remained possible through commitment to truth and prevention of similar suffering in future. The silver moon had cast long shadow over countless lives, its darkness extending far beyond physical confines of basement and cave system where victims had suffered. That darkness had touched families searching without answers, community members living with unacknowledged guilt, even territorial governance corrupted through participation in systematic cover-up. Yet within that darkness, persistent light had eventually emerged. Through Sarah's documented truth, through Seth and George's refusal to accept comfortable deception, through Emma's transformation of personal tragedy into constructive action. That light wouldn't eliminate shadows entirely, but illuminated path toward justice more complete than any court proceeding could provide alone. As they departed the Silver Moon site together, Seth and Georgia contemplated future extending beyond their temporary commitment here. Whatever path they eventually chose, their experience had fundamentally altered their understanding of responsibility, both individual and collective, for confronting injustice rather than accommodating it through silence. Behind them, the Silver Moon's physical location remained, no longer defining the town through concealed horror, but transforming gradually into memorial acknowledging truth too long buried. Before them stretched possibilities they couldn't yet fully envision, but would eventually pursue once their commitment here reached appropriate conclusion. Between past and future stood present moment, imperfect justice unfolding through legal proceedings, families continuing personal healing journeys, Foundation establishing mechanisms to prevent similar tragedies elsewhere. Within this complexity, they had found purpose neither had anticipated when first stepping into the charred remains of a saloon that had concealed darkness beyond imagination beneath its ordinary appearance.